Story 1. Stepmom falsely accused me of assault to stop me from getting my dad's inheritance when I was 21. My dad believed her and decided to cut me off. 7 years later, my dad found out the truth. Hello everyone. My biological parents split up when I was 9 months old, and my parents got equal custody of me. I would stay with my mom for 5 days a week since she lived near my school, and my weekends were spent with my dad. Despite their divorce, my parents have always been kind and gentle to me. Although I was unhappy that my parents were not together, I also understood that they loved me regardless of their relationship with each other. A couple of years later, my dad met my stepmother, Gina. When my dad first introduced my stepmom to me, I was 11 years old. She seemed really nice to me, and my dad looked so happy that we met, hoping for us to get along. She had twins, Emma and Emily, who were both 14 years old at that time, and had basically only been raised by her since their father had been absent from the time of their birth. This is why the girls were quite immature for their age and would throw tantrums publicly if Gina and my dad didn't buy them what they wanted or if things wouldn't go their way. I was an introvert and completely opposite to them, so I would sit silently and watch them embarrass themselves. After a year of dating, they decided to get married when I was 12, and even my mom attended their wedding. I was so happy that I had a new member in our family who would also be there for me. I thought my stepmother and I were getting along until, I think a few months after their honeymoon, she told me while we were alone one morning that she didn't really like me and that we just needed to pretend to like each other for my dad when he was around. She continued to tell me that whenever my dad was not there, I should not bother her since she hated seeing my face, which reminded her so much of my mom. My tiny heart broke hearing her cruel words. Words I did not expect her to say. I genuinely liked her and thought that our relationship was going to be okay. But alas, she did not see me that way. The twins, of course, heard her say this, and they would later tease me about how I didn't have a dad and my dad loved them more than me. I remember crying and telling my mom about this, who immediately called up my dad and gave him a hearing. My dad assured her that there was no way that stepmom would have said something like that to me and that I might have misheard her. The next weekend, when I came to meet my father, my stepmother seemed pissed. She didn't say a word in front of my dad, but as soon as he had left, she furiously whispered to me about how she was going to make sure that I would not have a dad left in my life if I ever told my mom anything about her. She also threatened me that she would divorce my dad and take away all his money. So if I didn't want to see my dad living on the streets, then I should keep my mouth shut. I was just 12 years old, and I was frightened for my dad, so I just nodded my head in agreement. From that day forward, Gina made it her personal mission to make my life hell in every way possible. And because I was a child, I thought I would have to take it with my mouth shut. Whenever it was just me and my stepmother, she would say things to get to me, and I would just not say anything, hoping and praying that she would stop bullying me. She would talk about my height and weight and would say how ugly I was. I hoped my dad would notice, but he never did. In fact, he thought Gina and I had a good relationship and would force me to go shopping and eating with her and the kids. She would take my dad's card to pay for our meals, yet she would not let me eat anything in the restaurant. I was only ever allowed to have soup or dessert, but no main course. I would sit miserably watching them finish off the main course while crying quietly. I would then come back home hungry, and she would then force me to go to bed hungry. There have been so many nights when I would cry myself to sleep, hungry and tired of her hate towards me. At that point, I was at my wit's end, scared, angry, and frustrated with both my stepmom and my dad. This is why I would dread visiting my dad during the weekends, and whenever it was Friday evening, I would try to escape visiting my dad by coming up with excuses like a stomach ache so I could stay over with my mom. Of course, my parents started noticing this, and my dad would call and tell me about how sad he was for not getting to see me. My mom would urge me to tell her if something was wrong, but I would always keep my mouth shut, still scared of Gina's threats. When I was 14 years old, my dad decided to take his entire family and me on a trip to Greece. Initially, I did not want to go, but my mother told me that this was a good opportunity for me to travel and experience the world, so I begrudgingly decided to join them. As usual, Gina pretended to be all sweet and kind in front of my dad, hugging me and asking me about school as if she was genuinely interested in my life. One thing I started noticing was that she would subtly tease me in her sweet voice, which was insulting to me, but at the same time, it would not outrightly portray her as being mean. For example, whenever I talked about how I was playing basketball, she would make jokes about how I should be taller if I wanted to play that sport, even though I was quite tall for my age, and would then say how I should concentrate more on studies rather than sports if I ever wanted to be something in my life. The twins would then smirk and call me names like meathead, even though I had better grades than them. My dad would notice this but would choose to ignore it. Whenever I would voice out that what she said made me uncomfortable and hurt, my dad would insist that she was just teasing and that I should lighten up. Gina would nod her head and tell my dad how I had no sense of humor and that I should have some fun just like she was. This continued to happen throughout the vacation, and one day, in a moment of anger when she and the twins were teasing me yet again about my weight while I was trying to enjoy the pool, I decided to be vindictive. I told the twins straight to their faces about how they both had double chins, which was embarrassing, and watched their faces fall. I then turned to look at Gina and told her that she should not be wearing a shrug over her bikini because I could still see her huge stomach protruding out, which made her look like a penguin. I watched Gina's face turn red in embarrassment, and she got up to run back to the hotel room. The twins started yelling at me for being sexist and saying how I was horrible to say this about them. Later, they told my dad, and he came to talk to me, clearly pissed. He asked if I had really talked to my stepmother and stepsisters that way, and when I nodded, he went on a rant about how he raised me better than this and how I should never talk to a woman about her weight. I argued back that they were talking about my weight, my looks, and my height. Yet my dad forced me to apologize to Gina, who apparently had locked herself in the washroom crying after what I had told her. She and the twins made a big show about accepting my apologies. When I returned back home, I, of course, told my mom about all this, and she again talked with my dad, who was trying to blame me for everything. But my mother threatened that if Gina ever commented about my weight or looks, then she would call CPS on my father. This scared my father straight, and I don't know how, but Gina never said anything to me after that. Of course, she and the twins would blatantly ignore my presence whenever my dad wasn't around, but honestly, I was fine with that. During a time when I was 16 years old, my mom was away for a few days. I had to stay with my dad and Gina. Gina had been complaining to my dad for a few days about how she hated cooking for one more member. So on my last night, I decided to take over cooking dinner since my mother had taught me to cook from a very young age as she wanted me to be independent. When my stepmom heard that I was going to cook, she told me that she wanted to invite a few of her friends also. I cooked, set up the table, and served dinner to everyone. Everyone seemed to love my food and even praised me later. My dad decided to clean the dishes, so I was free to go to my room. This is when I heard Gina and her friends talking very loudly outside my window while I was in my room. Her friends were telling her how lucky she was to have a nice husband and such a great house. When they mentioned how nice it was that I cooked for them that night, stepmom immediately went on a rant about how annoying I was and that she couldn't stand seeing my face. She told her friends how she couldn't wait until I was 18, so she wouldn't have to see me every weekend. When one of her friends mentioned again how nice I seemed, Gina told her that she had actually expected me to fail and was hoping that I would mess up cooking the dishes so she would have something to blame me for. This really shocked me because here I was trying to be polite to her, even though I knew that she hated me, but she seemed to have already made up her mind and refused to budge. As time passed, this hate just kept growing. During college, when I went away, I would sometimes come to visit my dad on his insistence for a few days, but even then, Gina would completely ignore me. She would knowingly schedule family activities with just dad and the twins or her and the twins so they would not be around much while I would be stuck at home. Every time I would wake up late because it was my vacation time, for Christ's sake, she would yell at me and tell me how embarrassing I was. She would call me lazy and inconsiderate if I made any messes around the house, even though I would always clean it up. I knew for a fact I was always respectful to her because my dad would have my head if I wasn't. I was very polite towards her and treated them very lightly to make sure I did not say or do anything that would upset her, but it felt like it was not enough and that I was still doing something wrong. She also was inconsiderate about my privacy. She would loudly come into my room while I was sleeping and wake me up or barge into my room without bothering to knock, which would make me extremely uncomfortable. She would randomly check my room and under my bed for God knows what. She would refuse to pick up dinner for me but would do it for the family and would not invite me to come down for dinner. Regardless of this, I would just keep my mouth shut and my head down and try to spend time with Dad whenever I could. Now, coming on to the main incident. When I turned 21, my dad asked me to come visit him. He told me how he had some important news to share. It had been a while since I visited my dad, so I was a bit apprehensive, but my mother encouraged me to visit, saying that he had some good news for me. I agreed and booked my tickets. When I arrived, I was greeted warmly by my dad at the airport, and we drove back to his place. I asked my dad what it was that he wanted to talk to me about, but he assured me that he would reveal everything during the family dinner. When we arrived, I noticed that the twins were home also. It had been a while since I had seen them. Emma and Emily didn't even bother acknowledging my presence, and neither did I. That night, during family dinner, my dad started saying how he was proud to have 3 wonderful children in his life. He spoke about how grateful he was to have such a loving family and how he wanted to share some exciting news. The atmosphere seemed positive, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation as my dad continued speaking. He looked at each of us with a smile, including Gina, who had been giving me icy glares all day. My dad continued to say how he had recently lost his friend to a heart attack, which had given him a harsh reality check and made him think about how lucky he was to have all of us. He had also spoken to a lawyer and made a will. Hearing the word will, I immediately watched Gina and the twins perk up in excitement. Dad continued to say how he had carefully thought about it and decided to leave the house to stepmom since she was his wife. Gina beamed in pride, hearing that, and kissed him on the cheeks. My dad lived in a 5-bedroom house, so if Gina ever decided to sell the place, she could have a fortune. Dad then continued to say that he had decided to leave me his entire retirement account money in his car. Now, my dad's car was not an ordinary car. It was a vintage car that he had spent a lot of money and time on maintaining. The car held sentimental value for both of us as he had often shared stories of his youth and adventures associated with it. I sat there, still processing the information, and realized that leaving the car to me was my dad's way of expressing his love. As my dad spoke about how proud he was for me to inherit the car, Gina's expression shifted from pride to discontent. She exchanged glances with the twins, who seemed equally displeased. It was evident that the prospect of me inheriting a substantial amount of money in the cherished vintage car fueled their resentment. Dad, seeming oblivious to the tension in the room, went on to say how he would leave the twins the joint bank account that he and Gina shared. Gina was a homemaker, so the money belonged to my dad entirely. He said that he wanted the money in that account to be equally divided between them. He told them how they would have money in this house to live in, so they had nothing to ever worry about in case something happened to him. I was honestly fine with this arrangement, and it seemed fair to everyone also. However, the twins immediately expressed how they had expected more, and that my dad should leave them his retirement account also since I did not need it anyway. When my dad asked them why they would think so, Gina started saying that I was a guy, so I should find my own way of living while they were women and would need more money for financial stability. My dad reminded Gina that he had already provided her children with college funds, and now they would even get their house and bank account, so they had absolutely nothing to worry about. Gina kept insisting how I didn't deserve so much money, but my dad reiterated that his mind was made up. I was sitting quietly and listening while they continued to argue. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Gina burst out crying. We looked at her concerned, and my dad told her that this wasn't even something to cry about since he had fairly divided everything. Gina, between sobs, started saying how she had kept her mouth shut for all these years to protect the family, but that she could no longer take it anymore. The room fell into an awkward silence, and my dad and I exchanged puzzled glances. Despite the tension, he gently urged Gina to share whatever was burdening her. Amidst sobs, Gina began to say how a few years ago, I had tried to force myself on her, but she had tried to hide it to protect me. I was taken aback, shocked by the unexpected accusation. Before I could even process what was happening, Gina began to elaborate on her false claims. She told my dad that after our vacation in Greece, where we had that argument over weight and height, I would always stare at her and try to come into her bedroom uninvited. I sat frozen in my chair as she continued to fabricate a story about how I would try to barge in every time she had a shower or come too close to her face when we were alone. She told my dad how she dreaded having me over every weekend because of this, since she was afraid that I would do this with the twins too. I tried to defend myself, furiously denying the baseless accusations and yelling at her for having the audacity to even make up such claims. But Gina continued to cry like a victim. She spoke about how as I started to grow older, I would make her more and more uncomfortable, and on one occasion when she and I were alone, I tried to force myself on her. My eyes widened in shock, and blood drained from her face after hearing such a huge accusation from her lips. My dad looked confused and concerned, and his eyes darted from me to Gina, clearly at a loss for words to say. Gina kept telling her story, saying she suffered in silence for years, afraid to speak up for the sake of the family. I yelled at Gina that she was a psycho, since there was no way that I had ever even looked at her inappropriately, let alone touched her. Gina yelled back that she was no longer going to keep her mouth shut and that she needed to expose a monster like me. The twins started shouting at me furiously for putting their mother through all this and used words like rapist and molester. My head was spinning, and all of this felt like a bad dream. I couldn't even imagine how a pleasant evening had turned into wild accusations being thrown at me. I looked at my dad for support, but he kept quiet, clearly trying to process everything that Gina had said. He asked her if what she had spoken was true, and Gina nodded, saying she would never lie to him about his own son, and that as his wife, he should believe her. While I tried to defend myself, my dad asked her again about why she didn't speak about this earlier, and Gina told him how she was afraid no one would believe her since I was a minor who was trying to do inappropriate things with her. After all, she was the stepmother who had married my dad, so people would not take her word. So she had to bear all this silently to protect the family. I was crying at this point, begging my dad to not believe her. I had never imagined that Gina was vile enough to make up such atrocious things, even after what she had put me through all those years. Unfortunately, Gina's manipulation had taken its toll on my relationship with my dad, and he seemed torn between trusting me and believing the woman he had married. The twins, influenced by their mother's narrative, chimed in with support for Gina's false accusations and yelled at me to get out of their house. I yelled back that this was my dad's place and that they shouldn't believe what their mother was saying since it wasn't true. My dad was sitting quietly in the midst of chaos. He then looked up at me and told me that I needed to leave the house until this matter was resolved. It felt like a punch to the gut, being rejected by my own father, who was believing his second wife over me. Hurt, confused, and betrayed, I packed my belongings and left the home I once thought was mine. I flew straight to be with my mother, who was shocked to see me at her doorstep. When I told her everything, she was beside herself with rage and was ready to go face up with stepmom, but I requested her to not do something like that since there was no guarantee about how psycho Gina was. If she could make up such crazy lies just to get me kicked out of my dad's house just because she was upset at what I was going to inherit, then she could make up a lot more to destroy my life. I couldn't take the risk of having her in my life any longer, and this is why I decided to cut off my dad permanently since he had chosen to believe her. He didn't deserve to have me in his life. Later, I heard from my mom that my dad did call and tell her about how he was ashamed to have a son like me and that he wanted nothing to do with me. My mom tried to defend me, but it fell on deaf ears. She also received a lot of flack from my dad's side of the family, who believed Gina's story as well and told my mother that she had raised a pervert. I can't even imagine how painful it must have been for my mother to have heard these words about her son. Clearly, the damage was done, and Gina had won. I wish I could write that my life started improving after cutting her off, but it didn't. Gina and the twins would continue to send me a barrage of text messages saying unspeakable things and threatening that I should stay away from my dad forever. It became so bad that I had to change my number just to escape them. Things didn't improve for me even after that, because after what Gina had put me through, I was scared of being with / near any woman. I was scared that I would be again falsely accused of something like this and lose my job and career. I was afraid to meet anyone or go out on dates. Throughout all this, Mom has stood by me and believed me. I went through severe depressive and suicidal episodes, and my mom flew to live with me for a couple of months so I would be all right. Slowly, my mental health recovered, and I started to live my life. Eventually, I met a wonderful woman named Mara who brought the sunshine into my life. She has absolutely changed my life, and my mom adores her as well. Mara and Mom are everything to me, and thanks to them, I continue to live my life with a purpose. Just a week ago, I received a call from an unknown number. Thinking it might have been Amazon, I picked it up. To my shock, it was Dad. I was taken aback by hearing his voice. The first thing he told me was how much he had missed me. It had been a long time, almost 7 years, since I had heard from him. He sounded old. I asked him about how he got my new number since not a lot of family members had it, but my dad dodged the question and asked me if I was doing okay. I kept quiet and then told him to not bother me again since I had nothing to tell him. This is when my dad broke down and started to cry. He begged me to forgive him and kept saying how bad he was to have abandoned his own son. My curiosity piqued, and I waited for him to explain himself. That is when my dad started to say how Gina had been cheating on him with his best friend for a few years, and after he confronted her with proof, she didn't even bother hiding any longer and said how she was tired of being married to a pathetic man like him. Gina revealed to him that she had only married him for his money and that she hated being someone like him. When my dad kept pushing her for more truth, she finally admitted how she had made up all those accusations about me because she hated me as well and wanted all my dad's wealth for herself and her daughter because they deserved it. As you can imagine, my dad divorced her, and she got nothing from the marriage since she had an affair, even though her lawyers tried to fight for alimony. My dad continued to say how he had been waiting to divorce Gina so he could officially get in touch with me and apologize for what he had put me through. He said how he wanted to catch up on lost time so we could have a better father-son relationship. At the mention of father and son, I couldn't help but scoff. I told him that he was no father of mine after how he quickly abandoned me for his wife's nasty accusations. I told him that I wanted nothing to do with him and didn't want him to bother me anymore. I cut the call and hoped that he would get the message. However, since then, I have been bombarded with calls from my dad and his side of the family, who I don't even talk with, about how my dad has suffered enough and I am just making it harder on him. I feel conflicted with their messages. I'd rather refuse to talk with my dad after he cut me off for false accusations by Gina. Update 1. Okay, so my post was locked, but hopefully it's okay now. I've posted the link and tried my best with spacing. I'm on mobile. For all the support and advice received, I really appreciate it, and I'm wholeheartedly so grateful to all who helped me to see how I was. Thank you. To explain a bit further, I am not just furious at my dad for believing my stepmother over me, but also for all those years she harassed me and he did nothing to protect me. I was the child, and she blackmailed and manipulated me while I would keep quiet. I have never told anyone about that. I think it's time I open up about this to my mom and let her know exactly what I went through since I know she will understand. Update 2. Hi everyone. It's been a week since I updated. For everyone concerned about my mental health, I am doing okay. Thank you everyone for being so kind. Now, first things first, I booked tickets for my mom to come and visit me so I could tell her and Mara everything. They already knew something was up with me. I started to tell them about how Dad had contacted me after all these years, which shocked my mom. She asked me why he did so, and I told her. She had no idea that he had gone through a divorce and was furious at Gina for what she had put everyone through. Then I told both of them about how Gina would manipulate me when I was just 12 years old. I told them about how she would bully me while Dad wasn't around and would threaten to divorce him if I ever decided to tell him. I didn't realize how traumatic these events were when I started to slowly open up about all those incidents that had happened to me, one by one. By the time I was done recounting, I had tears streaming down my face. Mara and my mom were crying quietly as well. My mom immediately got up to hug me and kept repeating how I should not have held this all in and that it was okay for me to share this. I cried for half an hour straight while my mom continued to hug me. Mara also told me how no child should have gone through this and that it was completely fine if I chose to not speak to my dad ever again since he should have done a better job protecting me. My mom nodded and told me that I didn't have any obligations to explain anything to my dad because when I needed him the most, he chose to believe his wife over me, and the only reason he was contacting me now was because he was lonely and had no family left. This is when I realized that they were indeed right. My dad perhaps never really loved me because had he really loved me and known me, he would have never believed that I was capable enough to sexually assault someone. Since then, my mind has been made up after the conversation. After years, I feel so much lighter saying all my past with Gina out loud to my mom and Mara. I have blocked my dad and will continue to block any other family member who decides to interject in my life. I owe no explanations to the ones who chose to abandon me. Update 3. Wow. I wrote this post 6 months ago, and I can't believe how much my life has changed since. I want to start by sharing something happy. I proposed to Mara and she said yes. My mom is happy for us, and we're thinking about moving closer to her because the schools are better there. Both of us can work from anywhere, so it makes sense for our future family. I've also started therapy, thanks to the advice of people on Reddit. It's helping me feel better step by step. I'm trying to focus on the good things in my life, like Mara and my mom. They've been there for me, and I'm grateful for their support. The past has been tough, but I'm looking ahead to a brighter future, free from all the lies and drama. Now on to the next story. Story 2. Before we start, if you're enjoying this video so far, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Now let's continue. Our son left us to marry a girl and never came back. Not even when my wife was battling cancer. Now that my wife is dead, he has come back, but with a different motive. I'm an old man, 72 years old to be exact. My wife, Elizabeth, passed away last week after battling cancer for 2 years. We were married for 48 years and loved each other deeply. Elizabeth was my rock, my best friend, and the love of my life. We had a good life together, living in the same big house we bought when we were newlyweds. It was always filled with laughter and love, especially when our son, Tom, was growing up. Tom was our only child, and we doted on him. We sent him to the best schools and supported all his dreams and ambitions. He was a good kid, always respectful and hardworking. When he went off to college, we were so proud. We thought he'd come back home after graduating, maybe find a job in the city and settle down nearby, but life had other plans. During his senior year, Tom met a girl named Anna. They fell in love quickly and got married right after graduation. We were happy for them, but we were also worried. They were so young, and Tom had just started his career. We offered to let them live with us until they got on their feet, but they declined. They wanted to make it on their own. First, Tom called regularly. He'd tell us about his new job, their apartment, and their life together. But as time went on, the calls became less frequent. Weeks turned into months, and before we knew it, a whole year had passed without hearing from him. We tried calling, but he never picked up. We sent letters, but they went unanswered. It was like he had disappeared from our lives completely. Elizabeth and I were heartbroken. We couldn't understand why our son had cut us off. We wondered if we had done something wrong, if we had been bad parents somehow. The house felt emptier than ever. We missed the sound of Tom's laughter, the way he'd bound down the stairs in the morning, even the mess he'd leave in the kitchen after making a midnight snack. As the years went by, we learned to live with the silence. We focused on each other, on our hobbies, on our friends. We traveled a bit, saw some of the places we'd always dreamed of visiting. But there was always a Tom-shaped hole in our hearts. Every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone, we'd think of him and wonder how he was doing. When Elizabeth got sick, I hoped Tom would somehow find out and come home. I imagined him rushing through the door, full of apologies and worry, but he never came. I took care of Elizabeth myself with help from our neighbors and friends. It was hard watching the vibrant woman I loved fade away, but we faced it together, just like we had faced everything else in our lives. After Elizabeth passed, I was lost. The house felt empty without her in it. I wandered from room to room, touching her things, remembering our life together. Planning her funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I wanted it to be perfect, a fitting tribute to the amazing woman she was. The day of the funeral arrived. I stood at the front of the church, greeting people as they came in, and then I saw him, Tom. He was older, of course, with touches of gray at his temples. Beside him was a woman I assumed was Anna, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. I froze, not knowing what to do or say. Tom approached me hesitantly. He looked nervous, his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying. We stared at each other for a moment, and then he hugged me. It was awkward at first, but then I felt myself relax into it. Felt like coming home. We didn't have time to talk much before the service started. Tom and his family sat in the front row with me throughout the service. I could hear him sniffling beside me. When it was time for people to share memories of Elizabeth, Tom stood up, his voice shaking. He talked about how patient and kind Elizabeth had been, how she always made his favorite cookies when he was sad, how she taught him to ride a bike and bandaged his scraped knees. By the end, we were all in tears. After the funeral, as people were leaving, Tom asked if we could talk. We went to a quiet corner of the church. He broke down then, apologizing over and over for not being there, for cutting us off, for missing out on so much time. He said he had been young and stupid, caught up in proving he could make it on his own. He said Anna had encouraged him to reach out many times, but he had been too ashamed. I listened to him, my heart breaking all over again, but I also felt a weight lifting. My son was back. He hadn't forgotten us, hadn't stopped loving us. He had just lost his way for a while. I forgave him. How could I not? He was my son and I loved him. We hugged again, and this time it felt right, natural, like no time had passed at all. Tom introduced me properly to Anna and the kids, my grandchildren. Couldn't believe it. The boy, Michael, was 8, and the girl, Emily, was 6. They were beautiful and they called me Grandpa right away. It was surreal. We all went back to the house after the funeral. As the kids explored the big old place, running up and down the stairs and exclaiming over everything, Tom and I sat in the living room. We talked for hours, catching up on all the lost years. He told me about his job, his life, his struggles and triumphs. I told him about Elizabeth's illness, about our travels, about how we'd missed him. As the evening wore on, I finally asked Tom what his plans were. He hesitated, then told me he had a good job in another state where he and his family had settled. They had a nice house, the kids were in good schools, and Anna had a career she loved. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was worried about me, about leaving me alone in this big house. But I knew what I had to do. I told him it was okay, that he should go back to his life. I said I was just happy to have him back in my life and that we could visit each other. Tom protested at first. He suggested I sell the house and move closer to them, but I couldn't do that. This house was full of memories of Elizabeth, of our life together. It was my home. In the end, Tom agreed to go back. We made plans for regular visits and phone calls. As they were leaving, Tom hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Dad. I love you." After they left, I sat in Elizabeth's favorite chair and cried. I cried for all the lost years, for Elizabeth, who didn't get to see this reconciliation, for the grandchildren we never knew we had, but I also cried from happiness. My family was whole again. Now, a week later, I'm wondering if I did the right thing. Should I have asked Tom to move back? Am I being selfish by staying in this house? But then I think of Tom's life, his career, his children's schools. I think of the life he's built for himself, and I know I made the right choice. Update 1. It's been 3 months since my last post, and a lot has changed. First, I want to thank everyone for their kind words and support. Your responses helped me feel more confident in my decision not to ask Tom to move back home after the funeral. Tom kept his promise to stay in touch. He called me every week, sometimes more often. We talked about everything, his work, the kids, my daily life. It felt good to reconnect with my son after so many years apart. About a month after the funeral, Tom surprised me by showing up for a weekend visit with his family. I was overjoyed to see them. We spent the weekend looking through old photo albums, telling stories about Elizabeth, and playing with the grandkids in the backyard. It felt like we were making up for lost time. To my surprise, these visits became a regular occurrence. Every other weekend, Tom and his family would drive down to spend time with me. Sometimes they'd stay overnight, other times just for the day. Each visit filled the house with laughter and life again. I started to look forward to these weekends, planning activities and cooking big meals for everyone. Tom seemed genuinely interested in my life. He asked about my friends, my hobbies, and how I was coping with Elizabeth's loss. He even helped me with some home repairs I'd been putting off. I felt touched by his attention and care. It seemed like he was really trying to make amends for the years he'd been absent. However, about 2 months into these regular visits, I started noticing something odd. Tom began asking more questions about financial matters. At first, it was casual. He'd ask how I was managing with just my pension or if I had considered downsizing to a smaller home. I didn't think much of it initially. I assumed he was just concerned about my well-being, but then the questions became more frequent and more specific. He asked about my savings, my investments, and even about Elizabeth's life insurance policy. He wanted to know if I had updated my will recently. These conversations made me uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. I told myself that Tom was just trying to make sure I was taken care of in my old age. Things came to a head last week when my sister, Linda, came to visit. After Tom and his family left on Sunday evening, Linda sat me down for a serious talk. She told me that several of our relatives and close friends had noticed Tom's behavior and were concerned. Apparently, Tom had been asking them questions about my financial situation as well. Linda mentioned that Tom had asked her about the value of the house and whether she knew anything about my pension program. He had even inquired about any potential inheritances from other family members. She was worried that Tom might be more interested in my money than in rebuilding our relationship. I was shocked and hurt by this revelation. I didn't want to believe it, but as I thought back over the past few months, I realized that Tom's questions had indeed become increasingly focused on financial matters. The realization made me angry and confused. Was this why he had suddenly reappeared in my life? Was he just after my money? I spent the next few days thinking over the situation. I thought about all the good moments we'd shared over the past few months. The laughter, the shared memories, the way Tom had helped around the house. It was hard to reconcile those experiences with the idea that he might have ulterior motives. Part of me wanted to confront Tom immediately, to demand an explanation for his behavior, but another part of me was afraid. What if it was true? What if I lost my son again, just when I thought I had him back? I decided to take a step back and observe. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on hearsay, even if it came from people I trusted. I resolved to pay closer attention to Tom's behavior during his next visit to see if I could discern his true intentions. Now I find myself in a difficult position. I'm grateful for the time I've been able to spend with my son and grandchildren. These past few months have brought me joy I hadn't felt in years, but I can't ignore the nagging doubts that have crept in. I'm torn between my love for my son and my need to protect myself. I don't want to believe that Tom is only interested in my money, but I can't dismiss the concerns of my sister and friends. I'm worried that confronting Tom might drive him away again, but I'm equally worried about being taken advantage of. So now I'm turning to you, Reddit. What should I do? How can I find out Tom's true intentions without jeopardizing our newly rebuilt relationship? Am I overreacting to these concerns, or should I be more cautious? Any advice would be appreciated as I navigate this complicated situation. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update, and I've made a difficult discovery about my son's true intentions. After much thought and consideration of the advice I received, I decided to test Tom to see if his renewed interest in my life was genuine or motivated by financial gain. I came up with a plan that I hoped would reveal Tom's true colors. I decided to tell him that I was ready to sell the house and move closer to him and his family. I thought this would give me a chance to observe his reaction and see how he'd handle the prospect of me actually becoming a more permanent part of his life. When Tom and his family arrived for their next weekend visit, I waited until after dinner to bring up the subject. The kids were playing in the living room and Tom, Anna, and I were sitting around the kitchen table. I took a deep breath and told them I'd been thinking a lot about my future. I said that living alone in this big house was becoming too much for me to handle. I told them I missed having family around and that I decided to sell the house and move closer to them. I watched their faces carefully as I spoke. Tom's reaction was not what I had hoped for. Instead of looking happy or excited at the prospect of having me nearby, he seemed taken aback. He exchanged a quick glance with Anna before asking me if I was sure about this decision. His voice sounded more concerned than pleased. Then Tom asked the question I had been dreading. How much did I think the house would sell for? I told him the estimated value, which was quite substantial given the size of the house and its location. As soon as I mentioned the figure, I saw a spark of interest in both Tom and Anna's eyes. They quickly recovered and started talking about how great it would be to have me closer. They discussed potential neighborhoods where I could live and even offered to help with the move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their enthusiasm was more about the money than about me. As the evening went on, Tom and Anna became more animated. They talked about all the things we could do together once I moved. They even suggested I could babysit the kids more often. On the surface, everything seemed positive, but something felt off. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, trying to make sense of Tom's reactions. As I was about to go back to my room after getting a glass of water, I heard hushed voices coming from the guest room where Tom and Anna were staying. I know it wasn't right, but I couldn't help myself. I stood near the door and listened. What I heard broke my heart. Tom and Anna were discussing the prospect of selling the house. Tom said that with that kind of money, they could pay off all their loans and still have plenty left over. He talked about renovating their home, buying a new car, and taking luxury vacations. Anna sounded excited too, but then she asked about where I would live. Tom's response chilled me to the bone. He said he would convince me to move into a retirement home or assisted living facility. He argued that would be better for everyone. I'd have round-the-clock care, and they wouldn't have to worry about me. Anna seemed hesitant, but Tom insisted he could persuade me. As I stood there listening, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. Anger, hurt, disappointment, and a deep aching sadness. This was my son, the little boy I had raised and loved, now plotting to take my home and put me in a facility just to get his hands on my money. I couldn't bear to listen anymore. Without thinking, I pushed open the door. Tom and Anna jumped, startled by my sudden appearance. The look on their faces when they realized I had overheard their conversation was a mixture of shock and guilt. For a moment, we all just stared at each other in silence. Then the dam broke. All the hurt and anger I had been holding back came pouring out. I accused Tom of being greedy and selfish. I reminded him that he hadn't even bothered to come see his mother when she was dying, and now he was back just because he needed money. I told him I knew about all the questions he'd been asking our relatives and friends about my finances. I said I had hoped he had truly wanted to reconnect, to be a family again, but now I saw that it was all about the money. Tom tried to defend himself. He said I had misunderstood, that he was just trying to plan for the future. He claimed he was worried about my well-being and wanted to make sure I was taken care of, but his excuses rang hollow in light of what I had just overheard. Anna sat silently, tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to defend Tom or offer any explanations of her own. Her silence spoke volumes. I told them both that I wanted them to leave immediately. It was the middle of the night, but I couldn't bear to have them in my house for another minute. Tom protested, saying they couldn't just pack up and go with the kids asleep, but I was adamant. As they hurriedly packed their things and woke the children, I sat in the living room feeling numb. The grandchildren, groggy and confused, asked what was happening. I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just hugged them and said goodbye, wondering if I would ever see them again. Before they left, Tom tried one last time to explain, to apologize, but I couldn't hear it. The trust was broken, and I couldn't see how it could ever be repaired. I told him not to come back, not to call, not to contact me in any way. Then I watched as they drove away into the night. The house felt emptier than ever. After they left, I spent the rest of the night sitting in Elizabeth's favorite chair, wondering how things had gone so wrong. I thought about all the happy memories we had made in this house, Elizabeth and me, and then with Tom as he grew up. It seemed impossible that it had come to this. In the days that followed, I went through a range of emotions. There was anger at Tom for his deception and at myself for being so easily fooled. There was sadness at losing my son and grandchildren all over again, but mostly there was a deep, aching loneliness. I considered calling Tom, trying to work things out, but every time I picked up the phone, I remembered what I had overheard and put it back down. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. Instead, I focused on moving forward with my life. I called my sister and a few close friends, explaining what had happened. Their support and understanding helped me through the darkest days. I started volunteering at a local community center, which gave me a sense of purpose and connection. I also made the decision to stay in my house. This was the home Elizabeth and I had built together, filled with a lifetime of memories. I wouldn't let Tom's actions taint that. I hired a part-time housekeeper to help with the upkeep, which made managing the place much easier. As the weeks passed, the pain began to lessen. I still had moments of sadness, especially when I thought about my grandchildren, but I also found myself appreciating the peace and independence of my life. I started to rediscover old hobbies and even made some new friends at the community center. Looking back, I realized that while the experience was painful, it taught me valuable lessons about self-respect and the importance of being cautious, even with family. I'm sad that things turned out this way with Tom, but I'm also proud of myself for standing up for what's right. Now, as I sit in our old house, surrounded by memories of Elizabeth, I feel a sense of contentment. Life may not have turned out the way I expected, but I'm determined to make the most of the years I have left, and I'll do it on my own terms, with the knowledge that I stayed true to myself and to Elizabeth's memory. Now on to the next story. Story 3. Kicked my fiancé's crazy ex-wife out of our wedding after she barged in and tried to stop it by telling everyone about my past. I, 27F, just got married to my husband, Brad, 33M, a week ago. Unfortunately, instead of enjoying this newlywed glow, we're unexpectedly dealing with a lot of flack, mostly from my husband's side of the family, after we publicly kicked his ex-wife out of our wedding when she tried to ruin our day. For context, Brad was married to Jessie for 2 years. They had been high school sweethearts for a long time when Jessie suddenly got pregnant at the mere age of 18, even though Brad and she had always been careful. When Jessie told him about it, Brad made it very clear to her that he didn't want to be a father so soon, as they were just starting college, but ultimately would support her no matter what decision she made. Jessie's parents also asked her not to become a mother at such a young age, but Jessie insisted that she wanted to keep the child. Brad and his family respected her decision, and she eventually gave birth to their son, Thomas. Jessie had to drop out of college so she could take care of their son, since her parents did not want to help her out much. Brad and his family sent her monthly child support payments as agreed upon and helped her out in any way that they could. Brad would meet and spend time with Thomas when he would come back from college and eventually fell in love with him. Even though initially he didn't want to become a father, he was glad to have Thomas and started to become more and more involved in his child's life. Jessie had always been close with his parents, so she and Thomas would spend a lot of time at his place with his parents. When Brad graduated and secured a good job, his parents had a serious discussion with him where they told him that they wanted him to step up and marry Jessie, so they could all become a family and take care of Thomas together. After a lot of discussions, Brad agreed and eventually they got married. Brad has told me since that he was never happy in their marriage, since he was too young and felt pushed by his parents to make this decision. He wanted Thomas to be happy and thought marrying Jessie would be the right decision for him. Unfortunately, their relationship quickly turned toxic. Now, Brad is a handsome guy, and he would sometimes get attention from his peers, which Jessie absolutely hated. He never cheated on her nor entertained anyone else, but Jessie quickly started to become abusive and resentful towards him due to her own insecurities. If he came home even 10 minutes late, she would start screaming at him that he was cheating on her and that he was sleeping with his coworkers. Brad would try his best to calm her down, but she would threaten him, saying things like she would run away with Thomas or Thomas would never love a cheating father like him. Their arguments became a daily occurrence, with Jessie even going as far as trying to contact his female coworkers through social media so she could stalk them. She would then subtly bring up their names in their conversations and would ask Brad if he found her attractive. Even if Brad would tell her no, because he genuinely didn't find them attractive, she would jump up screaming and shouting that he was a big liar and that he must be sleeping with them. She would have a problem with him going to hang out with his friends on the weekend when they just played video games all day and would insist that he take Thomas along with him. Brad would cave in, not because he wanted to listen to her demands, but because he didn't mind his son spending time with him and his friends. Brad's friends are super nice, and they all love Thomas, so no one really minded when Brad would show up with his son during their video gaming sessions. Overall, Brad did try his best to make sure that Jessie would eventually get over her insecurities and wild assumptions, but unfortunately, she never did. One time, Brad had to go on a business trip to meet and secure a very important client. Initially, he was going to go alone, but at the last moment, his boss, Kaylee, decided to join as well, since this was a very important client and they wanted to give a good first impression. When Brad told this to Jessie, she freaked out as expected and started saying how she always knew he was screwing around at the office and accused him of making up excuses to just go on a trip with his boss where they could do anything that they wanted. Brad pleaded with her to understand and even showed her their client profile, trying to make her understand how important and wealthy this client was and how his boss was just going to help him secure this client. Jessie did not care and continued to fight. She kept insisting that he should drop out and that his boss could go alone without him, but at this point, Brad had enough. He firmly told her that it was just a one-night trip and that he was not going to drop out since this would help with his promotions, which were coming up. They kept fighting, but Brad did leave for the business trip, promising her that he would be back very soon. As luck would have it, their business trip got extended by one more day as the client needed some more reassurances. So Brad talked with Jessie regarding the same. He thought everything would be okay, but when he returned back home, he found the house empty. Panicking, he called Jessie, but her sister, Nina, picked up the call and informed Brad that Jessie and Thomas would be staying with her for a couple of days as Jessie couldn't bear to look at him after what he had done. He was confused and asked Nina what she meant by that, as he had just gone on a business trip, but Nina started accusing him of cheating on Jessie and how despicable he was to do such a thing. Brad tried to explain, but she cut him off, so he decided to drive there and confront Jessie in person. Jessie and Brad have a huge fight when he shows up at Nina's place, demanding to see Thomas. Brad tries to talk some sense with her and even shows Nina all the evidence of how he met with his client and secured such a great deal which would help his career going forward. He then asks Jessie if she has any proof of what she is accusing him of, and Jessie starts insinuating how he stayed for one more night, so it must mean that he was up to something with his boss. Otherwise, why would he delay coming back to his family? At this point, Brad had done enough explaining, but Jessie stuck to her assumptions that he had cheated on her. So, after he met Thomas, he announced to Jessie that this was clearly not working out, so there was no point in staying together any longer. He told her that he wanted a divorce, but for the sake of their son, he was going to be cordial with her for the rest of their lives. Hearing this, Jessie did not expect this and started screaming at him that he was abandoning his family and many other abusive words that Brad has told me about. She even started to threaten him that she was going to ruin his life, but Brad knew that he didn't want to be with her anymore, as it was starting to affect his mental health. So he stuck by his guns and left Nina's place. Eventually, he informed his parents, who were shocked, but seeing how distraught Brad was and how unhappy he had been those 2 years, they eventually understood. Jessie, on the other hand, in her anger and frustration, decided to reach out to Brad's boss, Kaylee, through social media and send her a very improper, long message accusing her of sleeping with Brad and many other things. I don't know the exact fallout, but Brad has told me that Kaylee had a meeting with him and showed him the message, to which he was utterly embarrassed and begged her for forgiveness on behalf of Jessie. Fortunately, Kaylee understood, and Brad told her about how toxic his marriage had become and how Jessie had left their place when he came back from their business trip. After listening to his entire story, Kaylee was really understanding and asked Brad to take as much time as he needed to take care of this personal matter. This was the last straw that completely broke their relationship, and Brad immediately contacted a divorce lawyer so they could go their separate ways. I have heard from Brad that this divorce process was incredibly difficult for him, as Jessie would accuse him of the most preposterous things just to delay their divorce. She and her lawyer were also fighting for sole custody of Thomas, but thankfully, the judge saw through Jessie and gave them joint custody, recognizing Brad's genuine commitment to being a responsible and involved parent. Brad had been a single parent for a very long time when I came into the picture. I joined this company a year and a half ago. We became friends eventually and would hang out with everyone else as a group. A few months later, Brad asked me out, which was a pleasant surprise, since I had always had a tiny crush on him. I have never been the one who dates their coworkers, as I think it is a bit tacky and I like to keep my private life separate from my workplace, but Brad proved me wrong. Everything was effortless with him, and I loved how our relationship slowly transitioned from coworkers to friends to lovers. He is the kindest and most honest human being I have ever known. During dating, Brad was very upfront with me about his relationship with his ex-wife. He told me everything so that I would know everything before becoming more serious with him. It really pained me to see how hurt Brad was from his toxic relationship with Jessie. We changed each other for the better and have been together ever since then. Everything was fine until his ex-wife became aware of me, about 6 months into our relationship. Now, I knew how Jessie was based on what Brad had told me, but nothing would have prepared me for the sheer hate she had for me. Since we first met at a family event, I had met Brad's parents separately before, and they were the ones who had invited me for their Thanksgiving dinner. Jessie was invited as well, since Brad's parents had always involved her during family events. When Jessie showed up, she completely ignored my presence, even though I was standing right next to Brad. She hugged him and started touching his hair, remarking about how good he looked with the new hairstyle. Brad, clearly uncomfortable, loosened her grip and hugged me closer, telling her that I was his girlfriend. I smiled at her politely, and Jessie gave me an icy stare before excusing herself. The tension lingered throughout the dinner, with Jessie making passive-aggressive comments towards me since we were seated together. She would comment about how Brad liked blonde girls better and how she never thought he would end up with someone like me. Each word she spoke seemed carefully chosen to dig under my skin, and it only intensified as the evening wore on. I tried my best to brush off her hostility, focusing on engaging with Brad's parents and enjoying the Thanksgiving gathering. Brad, sensing my discomfort, would subtly reassure me, offering a protective embrace whenever he could. From my very first interaction with Jessie, I could see exactly why Brad had divorced her, because she was unbearable and hateful for no reason. I wish I could write that this was just an isolated incident, but Jessie continued to be awful towards me. One time, I caught her spreading malicious rumors about me with Brad's cousins and relatives, telling them how I was the reason for their divorce and how I had taken Brad away from his child. Brad and I confronted her about it, and I told her how I had not even joined the company when they were going through a divorce, so it was ridiculous of her to make up such a thing. Jessie smirked at me and started accusing me of being a gold digger and that I tricked him into a relationship with me. Brad asked her to stop and to be more respectful towards me, but unfortunately, she never listened. She once even went as far as to send me abusive messages from a fake page on Instagram. I knew it was her since the abusive messages were very specific, and only she would know. It was like a never-ending soap opera that we never signed up for. What really got to me was how she was using the kid in this situation. I had met Thomas occasionally prior to me and Brad dating, so when he and I got together, I was already familiar with Thomas. Brad never asked me to step up as a parent, nor did I want to take up a parent role in his child's life. I just wanted to be a good role model and friend to Thomas in times of need. Once, when he had his birthday, I brought him new skates, which he had been wanting for a long time. Thomas was overjoyed, and I was happy to see him so happy. The next weekend when I met him, I saw him wearing his old skates, so I asked him if the new skates I had gifted didn't fit him. Thomas then told me how his mother had told him that he couldn't keep them and she had thrown them away, even though he had pleaded with her. I was so hurt that I felt like crying there and then. My fiancée was horrified and confronted Jessie about it, but she claimed I had no right to be in contact with Thomas or give him gifts and said that she was disgusted that he even allowed me around their kid and said it made her question his judgment as a parent. It shocked me how cruel her words were. When I moved into Brad's place, she at first didn't allow Thomas to come and visit Brad, insisting that she couldn't trust their son with me around. Eventually, Brad's parents had to talk to her for her to allow Brad to see his own son. She would then try to make our lives difficult by saying how I was not allowed to cook for Thomas and would send food boxes whenever Thomas came to visit us. That poor child would heat those boxes for every meal, and it broke my heart. So, after a few times, I started to cook hot meals for him so we could all have dinners together, and we would just make sure not to mention it in front of Jessie. It was nuts that we had to lie about food, and I just didn't understand why Jessie would do all this. 3 months ago, Brad and I got engaged. It was the most beautiful surprise, and I knew that he was the man for me. When we called to inform our parents, Brad's parents insisted that they were going to throw a get-together for us. I invited some of my coworkers as well as my childhood friends. Everyone already knew this was our engagement party, so I thought Jessie would not be coming. Unfortunately, she did show up, and I braced myself for the evening. As expected, She would tell my coworkers and friends about how she was the first woman for Brad, even though everybody already knew about her. It was embarrassing that she was trying to steal our spotlight when it was, in fact, our engagement. I decided to ignore her and overall had a good time at the party. As the wedding was approaching, my mother and Brad's mother were in full-on planning mode. We were all working tirelessly to ensure every aspect of the celebration reflected the love and joy we felt, from choosing the perfect venue to selecting the color scheme and floral arrangements. Our days were filled with discussions and decisions. Just a week before our wedding, there was an unexpected knock on the door. I was working from home that day while Brad was away on a business trip. Thinking it might be my mother, I opened the door to see Jessie standing outside. This was quite unexpected, so I asked her if everything was okay and if Thomas was okay. She looked at me expressionless and told me that she needed to talk to me. I nodded and let her come in. Seated in our living room, Jessie straight up told me that I needed to call off the engagement with Brad. I was taken aback hearing this and asked her what she was even talking about. This is when Jessie started telling me how she knew about my dirty secret from my past. I scoffed at her and asked her what she meant and to get to the point, as I had no time to play her little games. Jessie told me that she had found out from one of my childhood friends, who she had met during our engagement party, that I had a miscarriage at the age of 21. I froze hearing this, since this was quite private information. It was true that I got pregnant at 21 accidentally, and I eventually went on to have a miscarriage, which was traumatic to live through. I was young, and I did not even know I was pregnant in the first place, so it really hurt to lose the fetus. I had grappled with the grief of losing a life I hadn't fully comprehended. My close friends and family knew about this, and they all helped me navigate this difficult time. I had already told Brad about this as well when we started dating, so I did not mind Jessie revealing this to him, as it wouldn't be a surprise to him at all, but it did bother me that she was using such vulnerable and painful information from my past to try to manipulate me. I firmly told her that she had no right to talk about my past and threaten me, since all my loved ones already knew about this. Jessie didn't expect this and started screaming how I was a bad human being for killing a child and that she was going to make sure that everybody knew how awful I was. The argument kept escalating, and she eventually stormed off, leaving me quite shaken and disturbed. When Brad returned home the next day, I recounted the bizarre encounter to him, and he decided to confront her in a phone call. He told her off for trying to come in between us and acknowledged that he already knew about my past. He defended me, saying how I was too young at that time to even understand what I was going through, and that she should not have ever used that information on me. In his anger, he uninvited Jessie from our upcoming wedding. She started screaming at him that if she was uninvited, then she would not be allowing Thomas to attend our wedding either. They went back and forth but didn't reach any agreement. I knew that Jessie would not accept defeat easily, but Brad assured me that he would not allow Jessie to come between us anymore and would take a stand against her publicly if need be. When our wedding day finally arrived, the air was filled with excitement and happiness. I was so excited to marry the love of my life and couldn't wait to take my vows. After I walked down the aisle with my dad, the ceremony was underway when Jessie, with her son Thomas in tow, barged into the venue wearing a floor-length off-white dress. Everyone turned to look at the unexpected intrusion when Jessie immediately said, "Stop the wedding." Color drained from my face as I turned to look at Brad, who was red with anger and embarrassment. Jessie then loudly demands that I should not marry Brad, otherwise she is going to reveal my secret to everyone right then and there. My eyes widened in shock as everyone looked around confused. Thomas kept looking at his father helplessly, clearly not wanting to be a part of this fiasco. She then walked towards us while shouting how terrible I was to marry Brad when I never deserved to be with someone like him. Before I could speak, Brad stood in front of me and Jessie and ordered her to leave peacefully before he called the police on her. Jessie's eyes widened in shock, seeing him unexpectedly stand up to her. She screams at him about how he could ever even think about marrying a woman like me. I was already in tears by this point, and our happiest day was slowly turning into the worst day ever. Fortunately, two of Brad's cousins, who were my bridesmaids, sprang into action with a quiet yet assertive demeanor. They escorted her out of the venue, warning her that if she didn't leave, then the police would be called, and this would affect her life. Jessie eventually retreated, still hurling accusations and insults, while Brad insisted that Thomas should stay for our wedding. The atmosphere remained tense, but Brad's parents and my parents came to hug us, seeing my tear-stricken face. Even Brad's parents, who had maintained a supportive relationship with Jessie, were shocked by her behavior. The priest asked if we should continue the ceremony, and Brad nodded while embracing me in his arms. We were determined to salvage what remained of our once joyous day. So despite what happened, we decided to have a good time. Now, after our wedding, we went on our honeymoon, so we did not check on our phones. But now that we are back, we have received multiple messages from Jessie's sister and some relatives from Brad's side of the family who all believe that we were too harsh on his ex-wife. Jessie has also sent several nasty messages to me, which I didn't even bother reading completely. So, Reddit, were we the a-holes for kicking Jessie out of the wedding? Update 1. Thank you everyone for your comments and continued support. Since I posted this a week ago, it's pretty clear that a majority of you agree that we did the right thing by kicking her out and that we should have involved the police sooner because of Jessie's toxic behavior. It's true that I could have involved the police sooner, but the thing that stops us is when we think of Thomas. We don't want to make his life difficult. So Brad and I have always tried to choose the peaceful way out, but it seems like Jessie doesn't respect our boundaries. Also, I did talk to my childhood friends to find out who it was that gave Jessie such private information about me in the first place. Turns out, one of my friends was too drunk that night during the party and, being a blabbermouth, revealed this secret to Jessie, who kept on asking my friend repeatedly about my past. This particular friend has since apologized when I confronted her about it, but our friendship, unfortunately, will never remain the same again. I understand that she was drunk and made a mistake, but Jessie used this to try to ruin my wedding. What really hurts me is that not only is she using my past against me, but she also involved Thomas in the middle of this. Brad also understands this and is currently in talks with his lawyer to see how he can navigate this co-parenting relationship with Jessie without her trying to make it more and more difficult for us. I will update you in a few days. Update 2. Hi guys. I know it's been 2 weeks since my last update, but nothing significant has happened until now for me to post an update regarding this incident. Yesterday, Brad's parents invited me, Brad, and Jessie to have a formal discussion regarding Thomas. They had not talked with Jessie since the wedding incident and had refused to pick up her calls, which was unexpected for Jessie. When we all sat down to discuss, they made it very clear to Jessie that they respected her as she was the mother of their grandchild and was married to Brad, but that they would go to any length to protect me since I was now married to him and they loved me like a daughter. They firmly told her that they would not stand for her to disrespect me in any way, as she did by barging into our wedding, and that if she continued to behave disgracefully, then they were ready to fight with her in court. Jessie clearly had never expected this reaction since Brad's parents had always been nice to her. I took this opportunity to come clean to Brad's parents about my miscarriage before Jessie would have a chance to manipulate them. To my surprise, Brad's parents didn't judge me at all, and they understood how painful it must have been for me. Brad's mother, Martha, turned to Jessie and asked her if this was the so-called secret that she had been wanting to reveal in front of everyone. Jessie nodded and said how she could never trust me around Thomas when I was such a bad person. Martha asked her what she meant by that, and Jessie went into a tirade about how I must have knowingly had the miscarriage and how I was never going to be a good mother, so she wanted to protect Brad from a gold digger like me. Brad's parents' expression shifted from confusion to disappointment. Martha told her that she had no right to say something like that about me when the miscarriage had happened unexpectedly and I was too young to go through something like that. Brad's parents, who had remained neutral for a long time, now understood the gravity of the situation and expressed their regret to me for not intervening and protecting me sooner from all this. Brad defended me as well and told Jessie that she had no idea what she was talking about and she should stop interfering in our marriage. He took this opportunity to set clear boundaries during the discussion. He declared that Jessie was no longer welcome at their home until she apologized for her disruptive behavior, and he made it clear that any further attempts to harass or threaten us would be met with legal action. Jessie started saying how he could not just do this to her when she was the mother of his child, but Brad stood his ground, saying that she was under no circumstances to contact me ever again nor come to our place when he was not around. He assured her that he had gathered evidence and consulted with lawyers, ready to take legal measures if she persisted in her disruptive and toxic behavior. Seeing a united front and the threat of taking this up legally, Jessie reluctantly agreed. Honestly, I am kind of glad that we confronted her, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. I am glad that my in-laws stood up for me and supported me against Jessie, since I had been going through this alone for a long time. I don't know if Jessie will ever change, but I'm just glad that I won't have to see her again, and that is enough for me now. Update 3. It's been 6 months since I last updated. Brad and I are doing well in our relationship. My relationship with Thomas has improved considerably over the last few months. I know a lot of you expected Jessie to continue to torment us, but surprisingly, after facing legal threats, she has not interfered in my life and only talks to Brad regarding their co-parenting duties whenever necessary. She does still have issues if I cook for Thomas or do his laundry, but overall, she has stayed out of my way. Thomas, sensing the newfound stability, has begun to adapt more positively to the harmonious co-parenting environment. We have continued to celebrate important milestones in his life together, ensuring that he feels the love and support of everyone. We recently took Thomas for a vacation up in the mountains, and I taught Thomas to ski. He is a bright child and a quick learner, so he learned it in no time. He is as adventurous as me. So this upcoming summer we have planned to learn to surf together. I don't know how long this peaceful phase will last, but I hope that Jessie continues to respect the boundaries we've set, allowing Thomas to thrive in an environment free from unnecessary conflict. Now on to the next story. Story 4. After my parents died, my sister and her husband planned to throw me out of the house and even took money from my college fund. But someone stepped in and surprised them. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, feeling lost and betrayed by my own family. I'm a 22-year-old college student in my final year, living with my older sister, Hannah, 29, her husband, Alex, 31, and their 5-year-old son, Jacob. It's been a tough year since our parents died in a car crash, and things have only gotten worse. Growing up, Hannah and I never had the best relationship. She's 7 years older than me, and I always felt like she hated me when I was born. Our parents were overjoyed. They'd been trying for another child for years, and I was their miracle baby. Hannah was already in elementary school by then, and I think she felt pushed aside. I remember one incident when I was about 6. It was my birthday, and our parents threw me a big party with all my friends from school. Hannah was 13 at the time, and she spent the whole day sulking in her room. When our mom tried to get her to join the celebration, Hannah screamed that she hated me and wished I'd never been born. I was too young to understand then, but that memory has always stuck with me. As we got older, the divide between us only grew. Our parents doted on me, always praising my grades and achievements. Hannah was a good student too, but she struggled more in school and didn't have as many extracurricular activities. I tried to include her in things, but she always pushed me away. When Hannah went off to college, I thought maybe things would get better between us, but whenever she came home for breaks, she'd barely acknowledge me. She'd spend most of her time out with friends or locked in her room. Our parents tried to get us to bond, but it always felt forced. After Hannah graduated and moved back home, things reached a breaking point. She'd constantly make mean comments about how I was the golden child and how unfair it was that our parents were paying for my college when she had student loans. I tried to explain that I'd gotten scholarships too, but she wouldn't listen. Then, last year, our world fell apart. Our parents were driving home from a weekend trip when a drunk driver hit them head-on. They both died at the scene. Hannah and I were devastated, but I thought maybe our shared grief would bring us closer. I was wrong. Since I moved in with Hannah and her family, she's been cold and distant. She barely speaks to me except to criticize or give orders. Alex isn't much better. He follows Hannah's lead and treats me like an unwanted house guest. The only bright spot is little Jacob, who adores me. We spend hours playing games and reading stories together. It's the one thing that makes this situation bearable. But yesterday everything fell apart. Jacob and I were playing hide and seek upstairs. He was running to hide when he tripped at the top of the stairs. I tried to grab him, but I wasn't fast enough. He tumbled down about half the flight before I could reach him. He had a small bump on his head, but he seemed okay, just scared and crying. Hannah and Alex came running when they heard the commotion. As soon as Hannah saw Jacob crying, she lost it. She started screaming at me, calling me irresponsible and dangerous. Alex picked up Jacob and took him to get checked out while Hannah continued her tirade. She said I was a bad influence on Jacob and that she couldn't trust me around him anymore. Then she dropped the bomb. She told me I had to move out. I was stunned. I tried to explain that it was an accident and that I would never hurt Jacob, but she wouldn't listen. When Alex got back from the doctor, Jacob was fine, just a small bruise. He backed Hannah up. They both insisted I had to leave immediately. I didn't know what to do. I have no other family, and I can't afford my own place while finishing school. I spent the night in my room packing up my stuff and trying to figure out my next move. This morning, something unexpected happened. Our dad's old friend and lawyer, Mr. Thompson, showed up at the house. Apparently, he'd heard about what was going on from a mutual friend of the family. He asked to speak to all of us together. Mr. Thompson explained that he wasn't supposed to reveal this information yet, but given the circumstances, he felt he had no choice. It turns out our dad had made a will before he died, and in it, he left the house to me. Hannah and Alex can't kick me out legally. It's my house. To say Hannah was furious would be an understatement. She started yelling about how it wasn't fair, how she was the older child and deserved the house. Alex tried to argue that they had Jacob to think about, that they couldn't just leave, but Mr. Thompson was firm. The will was clear, and if they contested it, they'd likely lose. So now I'm sitting here, in what I've just learned is my house, surrounded by half-packed boxes. Hannah and Alex are holing up in their room, probably trying to figure out what to do next. Jacob is confused and keeps asking why everyone is so upset. I don't know what's going to happen next. Part of me feels justified. After years of Hannah's jealousy and mistreatment, it feels like karma, but another part of me feels guilty. I don't want to make my nephew homeless, and despite everything, she is still my sister. I guess I'm looking for advice. Should I try to work something out with Hannah and Alex? Should I stand my ground and make them leave? I'm feeling overwhelmed and could use some outside perspective. Date 1. It's been a wild couple of weeks since my last post, and I wanted to give you all an update on what's been happening. First off, thank you to everyone who offered advice and support. It really helped me navigate this difficult situation. After the bombshell revelation about the will, things in the house were incredibly tense. Hannah and Alex refused to speak to me directly, only communicating through angry notes left on the kitchen counter. Jacob was confused and upset by all the tension, and I did my best to shield him from it. About a week after Mr. Thompson's visit, I received a letter from Hannah and Alex's lawyer. They were contesting the will, claiming that our dad must have been manipulated or not of sound mind when he made it. I was hurt and angry. Our dad had always been sharp as a tack, and the idea that someone had taken advantage of him was ridiculous. I called Mr. Thompson right away, and he assured me that the will was ironclad. He had extensive documentation of our dad's mental state at the time, including a recent medical evaluation. He also revealed something that made my blood boil. Apparently, Hannah had known about the will all along. It turns out that shortly after our parents died, Hannah had gone through their papers and found a copy of the will. She'd hidden it from me, hoping I'd never find out. Mr. Thompson only knew because our dad had mentioned it to him in passing, assuming Hannah would have told me. This revelation brought back a flood of memories from our childhood. I remembered a time when I was about 10 and Hannah was 17. I'd won a big academic award at school, and our parents had taken us all out to celebrate. Hannah had seemed happy for me at dinner, even giving me a hug, but later that night, I overheard her on the phone with a friend saying how she'd accidentally spilled soda on my award certificate. When I checked my backpack the next morning, the certificate was ruined. There was another incident when I was 14 and Hannah was 21. She was home from college for the summer, and I was excited to spend time with her. I'd been working on a short story for a writing contest, and I asked her to read it. She told me it was great and encouraged me to submit it. The day after I mailed it in, I found a crumpled-up first draft in the trash, covered in Hannah's handwriting, pointing out every flaw and calling it amateur garbage. These memories and the revelation about the will made me realize that Hannah's jealousy and resentment ran much deeper than I'd thought. I decided it was time to stand my ground. I had Mr. Thompson draft a formal response to their lawyer, refuting their claims and asserting my right to the house. I also instructed him to begin eviction proceedings. It felt harsh, but I knew I couldn't continue living with people who had such little regard for me. The day after the papers were served, all hell broke loose. Hannah confronted me in the kitchen, screaming about how I was tearing the family apart. She brought up every perceived slight from our childhood, twisting events to make herself the victim. She accused me of always being our parents' favorite, of stealing her chance at a good life. I stood my ground, calmly refuting her claims and pointing out her own manipulative behavior. I told her about the ruined award certificate and the writing contest incident. For a moment, she looked shocked that I knew about those things. Then her face hardened, and she spat out that I deserved it for always overshadowing her. Alex joined in, threatening to make my life miserable if I went through with the eviction. I reminded him that harassment was illegal, and that I wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities if necessary. This seemed to take him aback. I don't think he was used to me standing up for myself. Throughout all of this, poor Jacob was confused and scared. He kept trying to get Hannah and Alex's attention, but they were too focused on their anger towards me. Eventually, I took Jacob to my room and read him stories until he fell asleep, trying to give him some peace in the midst of the chaos. The next day, I came home from classes to find the house in disarray. Hannah and Alex had packed up most of their things and left. They'd taken Jacob with them, leaving only a curt note saying they were going to stay with Alex's parents until this was sorted out. I felt a mix of relief and sadness. On one hand, the constant tension in the house was gone. On the other, I missed Jacob terribly, and a small part of me still hoped for reconciliation with Hannah. That hope was short-lived, however. The next day, Mr. Thompson called me with some disturbing news. While going through the financial documents related to the will, he discovered some discrepancies. It appeared that a significant amount of money that was supposed to be my college fund, had been withdrawn over the past year. Given everything that had happened, I had a sinking feeling about where that money had gone. Mr. Thompson is looking into it further, and we may need to take legal action if our suspicions are confirmed. So that's where things stand now. I'm alone in the house, trying to focus on my studies while dealing with all this family drama. I'm hurt, angry, and honestly a little scared about what might happen next. But I'm also determined to stand up for myself and what's rightfully mine. I'll update again when I have more information about the financial situation or if anything else major happens. Thank you all again for your support. It means more than you know. Update 2. Hello everyone. It's been about a month since my last update, and a lot has happened. I want to thank you all again for your support and advice. It's been incredibly helpful during this difficult time. First, let's address the financial situation I mentioned in my last update. Mr. Thompson's investigation confirmed our suspicions. Hannah had indeed been dipping into my college fund over the past year. She'd withdrawn nearly $50,000, claiming it was for family expenses related to my living with them. This discovery brought back a memory from when I first moved in with Hannah and Alex after our parents' death. I'd overheard them arguing about money late one night. Hannah had been insisting they needed to use all the resources available to them, while Alex seemed hesitant. At the time, I thought they were just stressed about the added expense of having me there. Now I realized they were likely discussing my college fund. Mr. Thompson advised me to file a civil suit to recover the money. I was reluctant at first. Despite everything, Hannah was still my sister, and I worried about the impact on Jacob. But then I remembered all the times Hannah had taken advantage of me, all the way back to our childhood. There was the time when I was 12 and Hannah was 19, home for summer break from college. Our parents had given me some money to buy a new bike, and I was so excited. The day before we were supposed to go shopping, the money disappeared from my dresser. Hannah swore she hadn't taken it, and our parents ended up giving me more money for the bike. Years later, I found out from one of Hannah's old friends that she'd used the money for a spring break trip, bragging about how easy it was to fool her, naive little brother. With these memories fueling my resolve, I agreed to proceed with the lawsuit. Mr. Thompson filed the necessary paperwork, and we waited for Hannah's response. It didn't take long. 2 days after the suit was filed, Hannah showed up at the house alone. She was calmer than I'd seen her in years, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. She tried to convince me to drop the suit, alternating between guilt-tripping and veiled threats. She brought up our parents, asking what they would think of me suing my own sister. I countered by asking what they would think of her stealing from me. This seemed to strike a nerve, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of shame cross her face. Then she switched tactics, threatening to tell everyone we knew that I was abusive towards Jacob. I knew it was a bluff. There were no grounds for such an accusation, but it still hurt that she would even consider such a thing. I stood my ground, telling her that I was done being manipulated and taken advantage of. I told her that if she returned the money and agreed to family counseling, I would consider dropping the suit. She laughed bitterly and stormed out, saying I'd regret this. The next week was a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Hannah and Alex tried to countersue, claiming that the money was rightfully theirs as compensation for my living expenses. However, Mr. Thompson had thoroughly documented all of my contributions to the household, including the part-time job I'd taken to help with bills. During the proceedings, more financial irregularities came to light. It turned out that Hannah and Alex had been living well beyond their means, racking up credit card debt and taking out loans. They'd been using my college fund to cover their lavish lifestyle, assuming they'd never be caught. The judge was not impressed with Hannah and Alex's behavior. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Hannah and Alex were ordered to repay the full amount they'd taken from my college fund, plus interest. They were also formally evicted from the house, with 30 days to vacate the premises. I felt a mix of emotions as I left the courthouse. Relief that it was over, sadness for the relationship I'd lost with my sister, and worry for Jacob. Mr. Thompson assured me that we could petition for visitation rights with Jacob if Hannah tried to keep him from me. As I write this, Hannah and Alex are in the process of moving out. They've been cold and hostile, but thankfully there haven't been any major incidents. Jacob is confused and upset, and it breaks my heart to see him caught in the middle of all this. I'm trying to focus on the future now. With my college fund restored, I can finish my degree without financial stress. I'm also looking into therapy to help process everything that's happened. Part of me hopes that someday Hannah and I might be able to reconcile, but I'm also learning to accept that it might not happen, and that's okay. I deserve to be treated with respect and love, and I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being for someone who doesn't value me. Thank you all again for your support throughout this journey. Your kindness and advice have been a lifeline during this difficult time. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm feeling hopeful. Now on to the next story. Story 5. Sister drops her kids off due to an emergency, but I find out on social media it's for a child-free wedding, and her boyfriend doesn't even know she's a mom. Hey everyone, I've been quietly hanging around on Reddit for a while, and I have never really shared my own story here. But today I just feel the need to let everything out. So my sister, let's call her Miranda, has been a constant source of stress in my life. We never got along. She's quite manipulative and tends to display narcissistic traits. You see, Miranda was born prematurely, which seemed to trigger a protective streak in my parents. Unfortunately, this meant that throughout my life I often felt overlooked. They would forget to attend my school plays or basketball games and even neglected to pick me up from them. Birthday gifts were another sore point. While Miranda received thoughtful presents from our parents, which would make her smile, I would receive gifts like books or teddy bears, which I didn't even like. It's been a consistent theme of feeling overshadowed and neglected by my own sister. Dealing with my parents' wrongdoings was one thing, but my sister took it to another level, reveling in their favoritism. She would exploit their bias against me, like the time she tore my favorite dress to shreds while I was asleep, just because a guy she had a crush on asked me out instead of her. I was horrified and couldn't hold back the tears because I really loved the dress. When I reported it to my parents and they confronted her, she immediately played the victim card, crying and claiming she liked the guy first and that I was knowingly doing this to her since I hate her. To my dismay, My parents felt sorry for her after her sob story and suggested I avoid guys that my sister had a crush on to spare her feelings. It felt incredibly unjust since it wasn't even my fault that the guy liked me. In another instance, I put in a lot of effort to persuade my parents to take me to Six Flags for my birthday since I was an adventurous kid. However, my sister got wind of it and decided she wanted to go to Six Flags for her birthday as well, because her birthday came before mine. My parents gave in to her request. She didn't even sit on half of the rides, and I knew she chose this just to spite me. As a result, for my birthday, my parents took me out to our usual restaurant spot for a birthday dinner. I was so disappointed with them, but my parents told me that there was no point in going to Six Flags again in 1 year. When we started to grow up, Miranda just got worse with me. She would always give me backhanded compliments, like, "Your face looks better with your glasses," or, "You have a boy crush? I thought you were a lesbian growing up." I always tried not to stand out too much. However, unlike me, Miranda was everyone's favorite. She pretended to be kind and helpful to everyone, but behind closed doors was an absolute nightmare to me. She was sometimes nice to me only when she needed something from me, and after getting what she wanted, she would go back to ignoring me or bullying me. Her expertise in making me feel insecure extended beyond my looks to the people I dated. At 17, I had my first boyfriend, but Miranda managed to plant doubts in my mind about him, telling me how he was too good-looking for me and that he would eventually break up with me, so it was better if I broke up with him first. Every time my boyfriend would come over to visit me, she would get very close to him or try to touch his arms and laugh forcefully. Understandably, my boyfriend at that time was quite uncomfortable. After a few months of Miranda planting doubts in my head, I decided to break up with him. Now, when I look back, I understand it was completely wrong for me to treat him that way, since he seemed to be a genuinely nice guy. Later, as I pursued engineering in college in a different state, I would return home for holidays, only to be subjected to more of Miranda's sly and undermining comments. The toxic atmosphere continued to persist. At 25, Miranda met her husband, Dave, and they both decided to get married after 2 years of dating. She announced to everyone's surprise her upcoming nuptials with Dave, which was a shock to everyone since she had been dating other guys on the down low, and some of us knew about it. However, we were happy that she was finally settling down with a decent guy. Anyways, Miranda decided to designate me to be her maid of honor. My parents were overjoyed at the news that I was going to be a part of the wedding, while I had the completely opposite reaction. I knew that being her maid of honor wasn't going to be easy, and I was proved right. Miranda consistently used this position as a means to control and manipulate me. She would frequently threaten to demote or remove me from the role if I did anything that she didn't like, making the entire experience stressful. Whenever she sought my opinion, true to my nature, I would provide an honest answer. However, each time she would explode, deflect blame onto me, and engage in yelling fits. Faced with her volatile reactions, I adopted a strategy of staying silent to avoid saying anything that might escalate the situation further. I simply couldn't tolerate the verbal abuse and preferred to keep the peace. One day at lunch, we were discussing wedding plans, and I simply asked whether the maid of honor would be wearing a different dress, just to get a better idea of her vision. She started yelling, saying I was making everything about me by assuming I was still the maid of honor. We moved on to overnight guests and where they would sleep. My mom said it would be a good idea to book Airbnbs well in advance, and I agreed. My sister completely lost it, saying she'd had this conversation with her fiancé already and how they would be booking hotel rooms, and if we wanted Airbnbs, then we could book them on our own. Then she kept yelling at me for not using my brain enough and saying things like how I should discuss with her before agreeing to whatever others want, since I am her maid of honor and I basically work for her. I shut down, trying to diffuse the situation, so then she went on about how I'm being negative and trying to have an attitude. My mom tried to interrupt, but she talked over her and kept saying how she did not want to deal with such an immature maid of honor like me, and how I needed to do better. At this point, I am just quietly taking it since I just want her to stop yelling. Eventually, she decided it was time to leave, intending to head back to her apartment and for me to return home. As we reached the car, we sat in the parking lot, and she continued yelling at me for another 10 minutes, rehashing the same grievances. At that moment, all I wanted was to escape the situation, but my car was a 20-minute walk away, leaving me with no immediate way to leave. Eventually, the wedding day arrived, and while the ceremony itself went relatively well, my sister, Miranda, managed to find reasons to fight with me over trivial matters during the reception. She would openly yell at me in front of everyone, making the atmosphere uncomfortable and strained. I noticed her glaring at me between the festivities, whether it was about the music selection or the waitstaff not meeting her standards for serving drinks. When it was my turn to give the speech, I stood up hoping to share heartfelt words. However, Miranda gestured impatiently for me to get it over with. Later, she confronted me, criticizing my speech for delving into her childhood. According to her, I was intentionally trying to embarrass her in front of her in-laws. I was crushed because everyone else seemed to appreciate my speech, and even our parents had no complaints. The morning after the wedding, as the chaos finally settled, I realized the extent of the anxiety I had been feeling for the past couple of months, and it was all because of her. I finally realized that she had been the problem all along my entire life. I wish I could have been bold enough to drop out of the wedding. However, I knew my family would have blamed me. Now that the nightmare was over, I could finally shift my focus to my career. Eventually, a few months later, I met my current boyfriend, Tom. As we started dating and decided to move in together after a year of dating, my parents were happy for me. However, my sister expressed her disapproval to me, claiming that Tom was too nerdy in her eyes. He was just a computer geek. However, the truth was that Tom worked in IT and earned 3 times what I did. She had no idea about any of this, and I honestly didn't care. I was in love with this guy regardless of what she thought. One day, my life took an unexpected turn when my sister announced at a family dinner that she was pregnant. Now, if you are wondering how this affected me at all, well, my sister announced next how she couldn't wait to see me become an aunt because, apparently, she was going to need my help a lot during this tough time. I was shaken by her words. She was an adult who was going to have a child, and instead of asking her own husband or our parents for help, she expected me to babysit her child. You see, there had never been any children around me, so I had zero experience with them. I have honestly always felt totally alienated from kids and have never felt any desire to be around them. I was quite happy and at peace with the fact that I didn't want to have children. Hence, her words really freaked me out. I felt kind of trapped in that moment. I knew she would find some way to force me to babysit her child, especially because I have a work-from-home job, which would allow her full advantage to drop off her child whenever she wanted to. There was no boundary when it came to her. If I would try to establish one, my parents would come to her defense. When my sister had her first child, I occasionally took care of her, and it didn't bother me much since her husband worked the night shift and she had a day job. I was mainly there to look after the child while he could grab a few hours of sleep. I was never entirely on my own with the kid, and the first time I babysat, she was already 6 months old, making it a bit more manageable for me. Unfortunately, this arrangement didn't remain as occasional as it started. Over time, I ended up babysitting more frequently, and my sister would often criticize my babysitting approach. I would be trying to work when I suddenly received a call from my sister or my mother inquiring about my weekend plans. If I mentioned having no plans, they would declare that I was going to my sister's so she could take a break, and that was the end of the conversation. Their requests started making me feel like I had a secondary job where I worked, yet I was never paid anything in return. Now, you would expect that my sister was at least grateful for it, but nope, she never was. Every time I would go back home, she would call my mom and complain about what I did while looking after her child. Apparently, I wasn't changing the diaper properly or feeding the baby in the correct way. Just really petty things that bothered the hell out of me, especially since I was doing her a favor. Do you now understand how manipulative she was? My sister and I were clearly not close, and she should have been grateful that I was looking out for her. Yet she would be nice to my face, but then go behind my back and strain our relationship even more. After that, I got really pissed. This started to affect my mental health, and Tom started to notice the same. He and I had a talk where I completely broke down. He urged me to stand up for myself. So, the next time I was called for babysitting duties, I point-blank refused. Miranda and Mom would call me, urging me to do this for family, but I put my foot down and told them to go to hell. I felt like I had done enough and didn't want anything to do with my sister or her child ever again. I stopped all contact with my sister. She would show up at my door after calling me in vain, but I would still refuse to open up. My parents would also force me to forgive her, but eventually they gave up when they realized that I wasn't going to budge. I would talk to my parents sometimes, but that's that. This went on for 2 years, and she went on to have another child with Dave last year. My mom called me to tell me that Miranda and Dave were going through a divorce. This was quite unexpected. Even though I didn't want anything to do with her, I was still surprised by the news. When I pried a bit further, I found out from my mom that Miranda had been sleeping around with her coworkers. Apparently, Dave had found all these inappropriate messages on her second phone, which she would always hide from him. He had then taken all the evidence and talked with a lawyer to file for a divorce. Miranda was apparently completely blindsided by it since Dave right away handed her divorce papers. When she tried to reason with him, he told her how he knew everything. This made Miranda beg him for forgiveness, but he left her. I was quite shocked at the turn of events. Although, looking back, Dave was definitely too good for her, so I'm kind of glad that he is out of this mess now. After Miranda's divorce was done, she had to move back in with our parents. I would hear complaints from them about how Miranda would stay out all night and would come home in the morning drunk and smelling of booze. She was eventually let go of her job as well because she never went to work on time. This made her turn to booze more and more. My parents would have to take care of her children while she would be out having fun. This had been going on for months. In contrast to her life, my life was going well. Tom and I adopted a dog, and we are proud parents. We even bought a house together with both our names on the deed and have been slowly moving in. We have discussed the possibility of marriage soon, but there's absolutely no rush. We know that we are going to be in each other's lives forever, so we are taking our sweet time. When I had a housewarming party, I did have to invite my parents. Unfortunately, without asking me, they also brought my sister and her kids with them. I was pissed seeing her, but I didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone, so I kept quiet. Tom welcomed them in and served them drinks while I glared at my parents. My dad came up to me and sheepishly told me how he didn't want to bring his sister, but our mother wanted us to reconcile and thought this would be the perfect opportunity. My sister loudly announced to her kids to go and give me a hug since I was their aunt. I smiled politely as they hugged me. Miranda then started telling me how I should be a more involved aunt since the kids hardly recognized me and how I should put in more of an effort. I was grinding my teeth to stop myself from saying something to embarrass her in front of everyone. Throughout the party, I noticed Miranda drinking wine continuously. She wasn't the least bit concerned about what her children were up to. Her kids, on the other hand, were extremely rowdy. They chased after my dog, trying to kick it or pull its tail. They kept trying to enter our bedroom, which I had closed since I didn't want guests to enter. They even broke a vase while playing. I was reaching my boiling point and kept glancing at Miranda to see if she would tell them off, but she didn't even care. She was drinking and laughing with no care in the world. When some of the guests wanted to do a house tour, Miranda tagged along with them. I showed everyone the place, and then when we came down to our backyard, Miranda remarked loudly that this was too big for 2 people and started asking questions if I was planning on having kids. This immediately piqued everybody else's interest, and they looked at me expectantly. I immediately shut her down and told her how this was none of her business. But Miranda retorted back that my life choices were everyone's concern, especially as an aunt. I felt the frustration building up, but I maintained my composure in front of the guests. As the evening progressed, Miranda's intoxication level increased, and her behavior became more disruptive. She started making inappropriate comments about my relationship with Tom, implying that we were wasting our time by not getting married and having children. I could sense the discomfort in the room, but I chose to ignore her remarks. Later in the evening, when most of the guests had left, I decided it was time to address the situation. I pulled Miranda aside and confronted her about her behavior. I expressed my disappointment in her actions, especially considering the history between us. As expected, Miranda didn't take it well. She accused me of being stuck up and ungrateful for all the time she claimed I owed her for babysitting her children. My parents tried to mediate the situation, with my mother urging me to forgive Miranda once again. However, I stood firm in my decision and asked them all to leave. After this incident, I did not want to see her ever again and wanted nothing to do with my mother, who kept supporting Miranda. I thought if I didn't contact either of them, I would be fine. However, yesterday morning, there was a knock on my door that caught me off guard. When I opened it, I was met with the sight of my sister, Miranda, standing there with a desperate look on her face. She quickly explained that she was in a dire situation and needed my help. According to her, she had an emergency at work and couldn't find anyone else to look after her kids. She pleaded with me to take care of them, assuring me that it would only be for a few hours. I looked at the kids' faces, and they looked sleepy and tired, and it broke my heart how she had woken them up so early just to drop them at my place. I asked her what about my parents, and she informed me that they were at our aunt's place. She told me that I could verify with them, which I later did, obviously. When I told her that she could still call her ex-husband for help, she told me how he was still sleeping and wasn't picking up since he had a night job. Hence, she had no other option but to come to me for help. Begrudgingly, I agreed to look after the kids, and she happily left. As I closed the door behind her, a mix of frustration and empathy swirled within me. I couldn't fathom the audacity of Miranda dropping off her kids without any prior notice or consideration for my own plans. Despite my resentment, I decided to make the best of the situation for the sake of the innocent children. We played games and watched cartoons, and I even tried to engage them in some simple arts and crafts activities. Surprisingly, they were more docile once we got to know each other. And as time passed, I started to genuinely enjoy their company. When lunchtime arrived, I realized I had no idea if the kids had any allergies, and I couldn't take any risks of giving them meals without checking with Miranda first. I dialed Miranda's number, hoping for a swift answer. However, there was no response. I tried again after some time, only to be met with her voicemail. With no other option, I decided to be direct with the kids. I explained that their mom seemed busy at work and wasn't picking up her phone. Trying not to alarm them, I gently asked if they had any known allergies or specific dislikes when it came to food. The oldest, while talking about her preference, let slip that maybe her mom was busy at a wedding, which is why she wasn't picking up my calls. I furrowed my brow and questioned how she knew that. She hesitated before admitting that she overheard Miranda discussing it with a friend on their drive over to my place. The pieces fell into place, and a surge of anger coursed through me. I thanked the kids for their honesty and reassured them that everything would be all right. I immediately called my parents to get to the bottom of this. After much cajoling, my mother finally admitted the truth. Miranda had indeed gone to a wedding, which was supposed to be child-free, with her new boyfriend, who had no idea that she was a mom to 2 kids. My mother tried to justify Miranda's actions by saying things like how men didn't like dating single mothers, so she had chosen to keep her kids a secret. However, I was furious because she had lied to me once again. My sister had manipulated me, exploiting my willingness to help for her own convenience. I then checked Miranda's social media to verify the information. She had posted a few stories on her Instagram from the wedding. She was smiling and day drinking. I shook my head in disappointment as I saw her Instagram. I realized that she didn't have a single picture of her children. My sister, a mother of 2, was actively pretending to be single, denying her own children a place in her public life. Later, when Miranda came to pick up her kids, we had a huge fight. I made it clear to her that I wanted no part in her deception and warned her that the next time she left her kids with me, I would involve Child Protective Services. Miranda was pissed hearing this and started to abuse me. But Tom, who had by then returned back from the office, immediately intervened and threatened to call the police on her, which led to her leaving immediately. The encounter has left me feeling drained and emotionally exhausted. I am grateful that Tom supports me. However, my mother and my aunt have reached out to me, saying that I should be more sympathetic to the struggles of a single mother and how I should learn to help out my family in times of need, even if I don't want to be a part of my sister's lies. Update 1. Thank you all so much for being so understanding. I have received multiple messages from strangers checking up on me and telling me their own stories about toxic family members like my sister. After going through the comments, I have also come to the conclusion that my mother is extremely toxic and continues to let my sister walk all over me. Clearly, she continues to favor my sister over me, which is quite unfair since she is the messed up one. I plan on having a talk with her soon. I did call my aunt and ask her regarding her version of the events, and it turns out that my mother never mentioned the whole story to my aunt, so I did her the favor. After my aunt found out how Miranda lied to me and forced me to babysit and how she has been hiding her kids from her boyfriend, she apologized to me and told me that she would speak to my mom. I don't know what conversation they had, but my mother sent me a message saying how I should not involve myself in our personal matters and how I should not throw my sister under the bus. It is exhausting how much my mother can come up with ridiculous excuses to justify my sister's behavior, yet never actually reprimand her for anything. Update 2. It's been 2 weeks since my last update. Despite my efforts to distance myself from Miranda, the family tensions have escalated. My mother has continued to pressure me to forgive Miranda and participate in her life by babysitting her kids. She even started to emotionally blackmail me about how she and Dad were getting older and Miranda was going to be the only family left for me. I decided to have a candid conversation with her and asked her to meet up with me separately. I warned her to not bring up Miranda, and she agreed. I met my mother at a quiet cafe, hoping for a civil and honest conversation. As we settled into our seats, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the difficult discussion ahead. I began by expressing my love for her and my dad and my desire to maintain a healthy relationship with them. I acknowledged her concerns about growing older and the importance of family unity. However, I emphasized that my well-being was crucial for any meaningful relationship, including the one I shared with her. I explained the emotional toll Miranda's manipulations had taken on me over the years and how I needed to prioritize my mental health. My mother, visibly conflicted, listened as I recounted instances of Miranda's toxic behavior since our childhood and how it had affected my life. I shared my experiences of feeling overlooked, manipulated, and taken advantage of, hoping to convey the gravity of the situation. As I spoke, I could see a mix of emotions on her face, from guilt to realization. The conversation took an unexpected turn when my mother, after a thoughtful pause, admitted that she had, in fact, been aware of Miranda's manipulative tendencies, but had chosen to ignore them to maintain some sort of family harmony. She confessed that when Miranda was born prematurely, she had a bit of a health complication which had terrified my mother, and she had grown very protective of her. This made her blind to anything that Miranda did wrong since she was just grateful that her child was doing well. Hearing this broke my heart, and I pointed out to her how I was her child as well. I told her how I needed her as well while we were growing up and how it wasn't my fault that I was born perfectly healthy. I expressed empathy for the difficult position she found herself in, but I urged her to talk to Miranda. Otherwise, her kids are going to resent her just as much as I do. I stressed that healing within the family could only occur when everyone acknowledged and addressed the issues at hand. My mother nodded in understanding, which was quite shocking for me since I never thought she would even listen to me. We discussed the importance of setting boundaries, and I told her how I needed to have my space, so I was going to take some time off from her. My mother began to plead with me and told me how she hoped I would not go years without talking to her since she loved me and regretted what she had put me through. I assured her that I wouldn't and that I needed to take some time apart. Once things with my mother were resolved, I did feel much better. Later, my father also reached out to me separately, acknowledging Miranda's manipulative nature and expressing his understanding of my choice. He confessed that he regretted enabling Miranda's behavior over the years and assured me that he respected my decision to prioritize my well-being. He let me know that he was there for me whenever I needed him, which was honestly the best thing any parent can tell their child. I have cut off all contact with Miranda and installed cameras on my doorstep, so if she ever pulls the same stunt again, I can take legal action against her. Update 3. It's been 4 months since my last update. I have been hounded by people on Reddit to post an update. The reason I have been MIA is that I decided to get off social media and uninstalled all my apps. My mental health has improved considerably, and I have also been going to therapy. I have been focusing on my own personal growth. Tom and I are still going strong. He surprised me with a proposal last month when we were having a romantic date on a beach. It was honestly so sweet to see him tremble when he went down on his knees and took out the ring. I can't believe that I am finally going to be marrying this wonderful man in a few months. I have told my parents about it. Although we talk very little, My parents are extremely happy for me and adore Tom as well. I have received news that Miranda has moved out of my parents' house after my parents finally lost their patience with her, when she continued to come home late after partying and drinking the whole day. She, of course, fought with them, but in the end had no choice but to move out. My parents have offered to pay her 6 months' rent, after which she is on her own. Dave does pay her child support money every month, but I doubt it would cover her own personal expenses. I hope, for the sake of her kids, that she decides to grow up and be responsible for once in her life. Now on to the next story. Story 6. My stepdaughter tried to poison me on my honeymoon, and later pushed me down the stairs, so my husband threw her out of the house. Hi everyone. I'm in a really difficult situation and could use some advice. This is going to be a long post, so I apologize in advance. I'm a 45-year-old woman, and I recently got married to my boyfriend, Mark, 49M, who I've been dating for 3 years. Mark has an 18-year-old daughter, Jessica, who has never liked me. The situation with Jessica has been challenging from the start, and things have only gotten worse recently. I met Mark at a local community center where we both volunteered. I was helping out with an after-school tutoring program, and he was coaching a youth basketball team. We kept running into each other and started chatting. I was immediately drawn to his kind nature and sense of humor. I remember the first time we really talked. I was struggling to carry a heavy box of textbooks, and Mark offered to help. As we walked, he told me about how he'd started volunteering to set a good example for his daughter. I was touched by his dedication as a father. We ended up talking for over an hour that day, losing track of time. After a few weeks of these chance encounters, he asked me out for coffee. I was hesitant at first. I'd been single for a while and wasn't sure if I was ready to date again. But there was something about Mark that made me feel comfortable, so I agreed. Our first date was at a little cafe near the community center. I was nervous, but Mark put me at ease with his easygoing manner. We talked about our volunteering, our jobs. I work as a librarian. He's an architect, and our shared love of hiking. The conversation flowed naturally, and before I knew it, 3 hours had passed. At the time, I was still recovering from a painful divorce that had been finalized about 5 years earlier. My ex-husband, Tom, and I had been college sweethearts. We married young, just after graduation. For the first few years, things were good. We were building our careers and our life together, but as time went on, we started growing apart. Tom became more and more focused on his job as a corporate lawyer. He was working long hours and bringing work home on weekends. I felt like I was living with a stranger. We tried counseling, but it didn't help much. Then, about 8 years ago, Tom came home one night and confessed he'd been having an affair with a coworker. It had been going on for months. I was devastated. I'd suspected something was wrong, but I never imagined he'd cheat. The next few months were a blur of tears, arguments, and meetings with divorce lawyers. Tom moved out, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my life. The betrayal shook me to my core. I struggled with depression and had to start seeing a therapist. Took me a long time to feel ready to date again. I had a few short-lived relationships, but nothing serious. I was scared of getting hurt again, but with Mark, it was different. He was patient and understanding about my past, which made me feel safe opening up to him. Mark had his own painful history. His wife, Sarah, had passed away from breast cancer when Jessica was 10 years old. He'd been raising Jessica on his own for the past 8 years, and it was clear they had a very close bond. Mark told me about how hard it had been to watch Sarah go through chemo, trying to stay strong for Jessica while dealing with his own grief. After Sarah died, he'd thrown himself into being the best dad he could be. He learned to braid Jessica's hair, helped her with school projects, and never missed a soccer game. I admired how devoted he was as a father. It was one of the things that attracted me to him. I could see how much he loved Jessica, and I hoped that love could extend to include me, too. When Mark first introduced me to Jessica, I tried my best to be friendly and respectful. I knew I could never replace her mother, and I didn't want to try. I just hoped we could develop a positive relationship over time. I remember that first meeting clearly. Mark had invited me over for dinner. I was nervous, wanting to make a good impression. I'd brought a small gift for Jessica, A book I thought she might like based on what Mark had told me about her interests. Jessica was polite when Mark introduced us, but I could feel the tension. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she barely looked at me throughout dinner. When I gave her the book, she muttered a quiet thanks and set it aside without really looking at it. From the beginning, Jessica was cold and dismissive towards me. She'd barely respond when I tried to talk to her, and she'd often leave the room when I came in. If Mark and I were watching TV together, she'd pointedly put on headphones and ignore us. I tried not to take it personally at first. I figured she was still grieving her mom and struggling with seeing her dad with someone new. I gave her space and tried to let her warm up to me gradually. I'd ask about her interests in school, offer to help with homework, or suggest fun activities we could do together. Once, I noticed Jessica seemed stressed about an upcoming history test, so I offered to help her study, mentioning that I'd majored in history in college. She just rolled her eyes and said, "No offense, but I don't think you'd know anything about modern teaching methods." It stung, but I tried to brush it off. Another time, I invited Jessica to come hiking with Mark and me. I thought it might be nice to share an activity as a family. Jessica agreed, which surprised me, but during the hike, she stayed far ahead of us on the trail, refusing to engage in conversation. When we stopped for lunch, she put in earbuds and ignored us the whole time. As my relationship with Mark got more serious, Jessica's behavior towards me worsened. She'd make snide comments about my appearance or age. Once, when I was cooking dinner, she loudly complained that it smelled awful and ordered takeout instead. She'd intentionally exclude me from conversations or inside jokes with Mark. I remember one particularly hurtful incident. It was Jessica's 16th birthday, and I'd spent weeks planning a surprise party for her. I invited her friends, decorated the house, and baked her favorite cake. When Jessica got home and saw the surprise, she looked right past me to Mark and said, "Dad, why did you let her do this? You know I hate surprises." She then went to her room and refused to come out for the rest of the night. It was clear she resented my presence in their lives. I tried talking to Mark about it, but he always made excuses for her behavior. He'd say she was just going through a phase or that she needed more time to adjust. I could see it was hard for him to acknowledge the extent of the problem. Things came to a head when Mark and I got engaged. We'd been dating for about 2 years at that point. Mark proposed during a weekend trip to the beach. It was romantic and perfect. We were both so happy, but that happiness was short-lived. When we told Jessica about the engagement, she threw a huge tantrum. She screamed at Mark that he was betraying her mother's memory. She accused me of trying to replace her mom and said I'd been manipulating Mark all along. She told him if he married me, she'd never speak to him again. Mark was distraught but stood firm in his commitment to me. He tried to reason with Jessica, assuring her that he'd always love her and that I wasn't trying to replace her mom, but she wouldn't listen. She locked herself in her room and refused to come out for days. In the months leading up to the wedding, Jessica did everything she could to sabotage our relationship. She'd forget to pass on important messages from Mark to me. If I asked her to tell Mark I'd be home late from work, she'd conveniently forget, leading to worry and arguments. She spread rumors among family and friends that I was a gold digger after Mark's money. She told Mark's parents that I'd made disparaging comments about Sarah, which was completely untrue. It caused a lot of tension with Mark's family, who had been welcoming to me before. She even created a fake social media profile and sent me harassing messages, though we eventually figured out it was her. The messages were cruel, calling me old and ugly, saying Mark would realize his mistake and leave me. When confronted, Jessica denied it at first, then shrugged it off as just a joke. Despite all this, Mark and I were determined to make our relationship work. We went to family counseling, but Jessica refused to participate meaningfully. She'd sit silently during sessions or give one-word answers to the therapist's questions. I kept trying to connect with Jessica, but she rejected every overture. I'd invite her to go shopping or get manicures together, things I thought teenage girls might enjoy. She always had an excuse not to go. If I bought her gifts, I'd later find them in the trash. It broke my heart to see the pain this was causing Mark, torn between his daughter and our relationship. He'd confide in me late at night, worried that he was failing as a father. I tried to reassure him, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. When our wedding day arrived, Jessica refused to attend. It cast a shadow over what should have been the happiest day of our lives. Mark was crushed that his daughter wasn't there to see him get married. I felt horrible, wondering if I was to blame for this rift between them. The ceremony was beautiful, but I could see the sadness in Mark's eyes when he looked at the empty seat where Jessica should have been. We'd left it open, hoping she might change her mind at the last minute. She didn't. After the ceremony, Mark suggested we bring Jessica on our honeymoon to Morocco. He thought it might be a chance for us to bond as a family. I was hesitant at first. I'd been looking forward to romantic time alone with my new husband, but I could see how much it meant to Mark, so I agreed. We made arrangements for Jessica to stay in a separate room on a different floor of the hotel, so Mark and I would still have privacy. I hoped that being in a new, exciting place might help Jessica open up and give me another chance. The flight to Morocco was tense. Jessica ignored me completely, speaking only to Mark. When we arrived at the hotel, she immediately went to her room, saying she was tired from the journey. The first day of the trip was uneventful. We all went sightseeing together, but Jessica kept to herself mostly. She was polite enough when we all had dinner together, but there was no real conversation. I tried to stay optimistic that things might improve. The next morning, I woke up to Jessica knocking on our hotel room door. She said she wanted to get breakfast, and Mark was still asleep. I was surprised she wanted to spend time with just me, but I readily agreed. Maybe this was a sign she was warming up to me after all. At the hotel restaurant, Jessica insisted on ordering for both of us. She said she'd heard about a special local dessert we had to try. When it arrived, it looked delicious. A pastry topped with ice cream and chocolate chips. In my sleepy morning state, I didn't think to ask about the ingredients. I took a big bite. Within minutes, my throat started to close up. I felt dizzy and nauseous. I realized with horror that the dessert must have contained peanut butter, which I'm severely allergic to. I managed to gasp out that I needed help before collapsing. The next few hours were a blur. I was rushed to the ER where they treated me for anaphylactic shock. If I hadn't gotten medical attention so quickly, I could have died. When I was finally stabilized, Mark was there, holding my hand, looking terrified. He told me that he'd investigated what happened. It turned out Jessica had specifically requested peanut butter in the dessert, even though she knew about my allergy. The hotel staff was horrified when they found out. They said if anyone had informed them of my allergy, they never would have served me that dessert. I felt sick to my stomach, and not just from the allergic reaction. I couldn't believe Jessica would deliberately try to harm me like that. Part of me didn't want to believe it. Surely she wouldn't go that far, but the evidence was clear. Mark was livid. He'd had a long, intense conversation with Jessica while I was being treated. He told her that her behavior was completely unacceptable and dangerous. He said he was sending her home immediately and that, going forward, he would only pay for her college tuition. She'd have to support herself otherwise. I felt awful seeing Mark have to discipline his daughter like that. Despite everything, I knew how much he loved her, but I also felt relieved that he was finally drawing a firm line. Jessica's actions could have killed me. Clearly, the situation couldn't go on as it had been. The rest of our honeymoon was subdued. We tried to enjoy Morocco, but the incident cast a pall over everything. We visited the markets in Marrakesh and took a day trip to the Atlas Mountains, but my heart wasn't in it. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, wondering if there were signs I'd missed. Should I have been more cautious? Was there something else I could have done to improve my relationship with Jessica? Mark was attentive and caring, but I could tell he was struggling, too. He was angry at Jessica but also grieving the relationship he wished we could all have. We spent a lot of time talking through our feelings and trying to figure out how to move forward. Now we're home, and I'm not sure what to do next. Jessica is still living with us for now, at least until college starts in the fall. The atmosphere in the house is tense and uncomfortable. Jessica barely speaks to me, acting like I don't exist. She hasn't apologized or shown any remorse for what happened. I want to support Mark in reconnecting with his daughter, but I'm also scared of what she might do next. The incident in Morocco showed she's willing to put my health at risk. I don't feel safe in my own home anymore. Mark is trying his best to mediate, but I can tell he's torn. He wants to believe Jessica will come around eventually, but he's also worried about my well-being. We're considering family therapy again, but I'm not sure Jessica will agree to participate. I love Mark deeply, and I want to make this marriage work, but I'm at a loss for how to handle the situation with Jessica. Has anyone dealt with something similar? How do you mend a relationship with a stepchild who seems to hate you? Is there any hope of us becoming a real family? Or am I fooling myself? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for reading this far. Edit. Thank you all for your supportive comments and advice. I've read through everything, and I'm taking it to heart. I wanted to post an update on the situation as some significant things have happened in the past 2 weeks. Update 1. Mark and I have been home for about 2 weeks now. Things with Jessica haven't improved much. I'm sad to say she's still barely speaking to me, acting as if I don't exist in the house. What's most concerning is that she doesn't seem apologetic at all about what happened in Morocco. If anything, she seems angrier than before. I think a lot of her anger is now directed at me because of Mark's decision to cut her off financially except for tuition. She seems to blame me entirely for this, even though it was Mark's choice in response to her dangerous behavior. The first few days after we got back were incredibly tense. Jessica stayed in her room most of the time, only coming out for meals. When she did, she'd ignore me completely, speaking only to Mark if she had to. I tried to give her space, hoping she might come around if I didn't push. One evening, I overheard her talking on the phone to a friend. She was complaining about me, saying I'd ruined everything and that her dad had chosen me over her. It hurt to hear, but it also gave me some insight into how she was feeling. Mark has tried talking to her several times, but she just shuts down or lashes out. I remember one particularly heated argument where Jessica accused Mark of forgetting about her mother. She said he was trying to erase their past and create a new family without her. Mark was devastated by this accusation. We looked into family therapy again, but Jessica refused to participate. She said there was no point since she'd be leaving for college soon anyway. Mark and I have been going to couples counseling to work through our own feelings about the situation. It's been helpful, but I wish Jessica would join us. The tension in the house has been unbearable. I've been trying to give Jessica space, staying out of her way as much as possible, but it's exhausting, walking on eggshells in my own home all the time. I've started spending more time at work or out of the house just to avoid the uncomfortable atmosphere. I've also been dealing with some anxiety since the incident in Morocco. I find myself double-checking ingredients obsessively, even for foods I've eaten many times before. I had a panic attack in a restaurant last week when I couldn't be sure if my meal was completely peanut-free. Mark has been supportive, but I can tell he's worried about me. Things came to a head yesterday. I was coming down the stairs when I overheard Jessica and Mark arguing in the living room. I paused, not wanting to interrupt. Jessica was yelling at Mark, saying he'd ruined her life by marrying me. She called me some pretty awful names I'd rather not repeat. I could hear the pain in Mark's voice as he tried to reason with her. He was pleading with her to give me a chance to try and be part of our family. Jessica's voice was getting louder and more hysterical. She accused Mark of loving me more than her, of forgetting about her mother. The emotion in her voice was raw and painful to hear. I must have made a noise or something because suddenly they both realized I was there. Jessica's face twisted with anger when she saw me. Before I could react, she rushed towards me and shoved me hard. I lost my balance and fell backward down the stairs. Everything happened so fast. I remember a sharp pain in my head, and then everything went black. I woke up in the ER again. The doctors told me I had a concussion and some bruising, but thankfully no broken bones. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation, just to be safe. Mark has been by my side the whole time, looking devastated. He told me that after I fell, he called an ambulance immediately. While we were waiting, he told Jessica to pack her things and leave. He said he couldn't have her in the house anymore if she was going to be physically violent. I feel terrible that it's come to this. Despite everything, I never wanted Jessica to be kicked out of her home. I know how much Mark loves her, and I worry about how this will affect their relationship long term. At the same time, I'm relieved. The idea of going back to that house with Jessica there was terrifying. I hate feeling unsafe in my own home, And clearly, the situation had become dangerous, not just emotionally but physically. The doctors say I should be able to go home tomorrow. Mark and I have a lot to discuss about what happens next. I'm not sure where Jessica is staying right now, probably with her grandparents. I don't know if Mark will try to reconcile with her again or if this is a more permanent estrangement. I'm feeling overwhelmed and unsure of everything. The physical pain from the fall is nothing compared to the emotional turmoil. I keep replaying the moment Jessica pushed me, trying to understand how we got to this point. Was there something more I could have done? Is there any way to repair this relationship? Part of me wonders if I should just leave to make things easier for Mark and Jessica to repair their relationship. But I love Mark, and we've worked so hard to build a life together. I don't want to give up on our marriage. I guess I'm looking for advice again. How do we move forward from here? Is there any way to salvage the situation with Jessica? Or is it time to accept that she may never be part of our lives? How do I support Mark through this estrangement from his daughter? I'm also struggling with my own feelings towards Jessica. I've tried so hard to be understanding, to give her time and space, but after this physical attack, I'm finding it hard not to be angry and resentful. How do I process these emotions in a healthy way? Mark and I have barely had time to talk about everything that's happened. He's been focused on making sure I'm okay and dealing with the immediate aftermath of the incident. But I know we need to have some serious conversations about our future once I'm out of the hospital. Thank you all again for listening and for any insights you can offer. This whole situation has been so difficult, and I really appreciate having a place to talk about it. I'll update again when I know more about what's going to happen next. Now on to the next story. Story 7. I overheard my fiancée laughing with her brother in our bedroom. Turns out they'd been having an affair for 8 months. I moved to a new city and started over. I never thought I'd be in this situation. But here I am, pouring my heart out to strangers on the internet. My name is Alex, 28M, and I'm about to tell you how my life crumbled in a matter of months. I met Dorothy, 27F, during our sophomore year of college. We were both biology majors, struggling through organic chemistry together. I remember the first time I saw her. She was bent over a microscope, her dark hair falling in waves around her face, completely absorbed in her work. I was immediately drawn to her intensity and focus. Our relationship started slowly. We were lab partners first, then study buddies. Late nights in the library turned into coffee dates, which eventually became dinner dates. Dorothy was everything I could have wanted in a partner. Brilliant, driven, and with a wicked sense of humor that never failed to make me laugh. We graduated together, both landing entry-level jobs at pharmaceutical companies in the same city. Felt like everything was falling into place. We moved in together after 3 years, renting a small but cozy apartment downtown. Our life together was comfortable and happy. We had our routines: Sunday brunches, movie nights on Wednesdays, and weekend hikes when the weather was good. Dorothy's family became like my own. Her parents, Mark and Sarah, welcomed me with open arms. They were warm, kind people who made me feel at home from the first time I met them. And then there was Ethan, 24M, Dorothy's younger brother. He was still in college when Dorothy and I started dating, studying computer science. Despite the age difference, Ethan and I hit it off immediately. We bonded over our shared love of video games and obscure sci-fi movies. He became the little brother I never had. As the years passed, our careers progressed. Dorothy was climbing the ranks at her company, impressing everyone with her innovative research. I was doing well too, but I couldn't help feeling a bit overshadowed by her success. Still, I was proud of her and supported her every step of the way. It was on our 6th anniversary that I decided to propose. I spent months planning the perfect surprise, enlisting the help of our families and friends. I even asked Ethan to help me pick out the ring, knowing he had a good sense of Dorothy's taste. We spent a whole Saturday going from jeweler to jeweler until we found the perfect one. A vintage-inspired diamond ring that I knew Dorothy would love. The proposal itself was elaborate. I set up a scavenger hunt around the city, each location significant to our relationship. The final stop was the rooftop garden where we had our first kiss. I was on one knee when she arrived, surrounded by candles and flowers. When I asked her to marry me, she said yes, and for a moment, everything was perfect. We celebrated with our loved ones afterward. I remember looking around the room at all the smiling faces. Our parents, our friends, Ethan, and feeling like the luckiest man alive. If only I had known what was coming. That night, as we lay in bed, Dorothy turned to me with tears in her eyes. I thought they were happy tears at first, but the look on her face told me otherwise. She confessed that she had been having doubts about our relationship for the past year. She said she loved me, but she wasn't sure if she was in love with me anymore. I was blindsided. We had never had any major issues, and she had never expressed any doubts before. I asked her why she had said yes to my proposal if she felt this way. She said she had hoped that taking this step would rekindle her feelings, that maybe her doubts were just pre-commitment jitters. We decided to postpone announcing our engagement and work on our relationship. We started going on more dates, trying new things together, and even went to a couples workshop. I threw myself into making our relationship work, determined to reignite the spark we once had. Things seemed to be improving. Dorothy was more affectionate, more engaged. We were talking more, laughing more. I started to feel hopeful again. I thought we were on the right track. About 2 months after the proposal, I came home early from work. I had managed to score tickets to Dorothy's favorite band's concert, and I wanted to surprise her. As I walked into our apartment, I heard voices coming from our bedroom. I recognized Dorothy's laugh, but the other voice made my blood run cold. It was Ethan. I stood outside the bedroom door, frozen in place. I heard them talking and laughing intimately, then silence. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. My mind was racing, trying to come up with innocent explanations for what I was hearing. But deep down, I knew. I quietly left the apartment and went to a nearby park, where I sat for hours trying to process what I had just heard. The sun was setting by the time I finally returned home. Dorothy was in the kitchen, acting as if nothing was wrong. She smiled when she saw me, asked about my day. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I confronted her about what I had heard. At first, she tried to deny it, saying Ethan had just stopped by to drop off some books. But when I pressed her, describing exactly what I had heard, she broke down. Dorothy admitted that she and Ethan had been having an affair for the past 8 months. It started when we were going through a rough patch, and Ethan had comforted her. One thing led to another, and before they knew it, they were in too deep. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Not only had my fiancée cheated on me, but she had done it with my future brother-in-law, someone I considered a friend. The betrayal was overwhelming. I packed a bag and left that night, staying with a college buddy who lived nearby. The next few days were a blur. I called in sick to work and barely ate or slept. Dorothy kept calling and texting, begging me to come home so we could talk. I ignored her messages, needing time to think. A week after I left, I received a call from Mark and Sarah, Dorothy's parents. They wanted to know why I had moved out and why Dorothy was so upset. I realized she hadn't told them the truth. In that moment, I made a decision. I told them everything. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. She apologized profusely and said they would talk to Dorothy and Ethan. Mark got on the phone too, assuring me that this behavior was not something they condoned or had ever expected from their children. Now it's been 2 weeks since I found out about the affair. I'm still staying with my friend, trying to figure out what to do next. Dorothy has stopped calling, but Ethan has started. He's left voicemails apologizing and begging for forgiveness. I haven't listened to any of them fully. Our friends are divided. Some are supportive of me, while others think I should give Dorothy another chance. They say everyone makes mistakes, that 8 years of a relationship shouldn't be thrown away over one indiscretion. But to me, it wasn't just one indiscretion. It was 8 months of lying and betrayal. My parents are furious. They want me to cut all ties with Dorothy and her family. My mom, in particular, is heartbroken. She had always thought of Dorothy as the daughter she never had. I'm lost and don't know what to do. Part of me still loves Dorothy and wants to believe we can work through this. We've been through so much together. College, starting our careers, building a life. But another part of me knows that the trust is irreparably broken. How can I ever look at Ethan again without feeling betrayed? How can I ever trust Dorothy when she's alone with her brother? I'm considering making a drastic change. My company has an office in Seattle, and I've always loved the Pacific Northwest. I've been thinking about requesting a transfer. Maybe a fresh start in a new city is what I need. But is running away the answer? I need advice. Am I overreacting by considering such a drastic move? Should I give Dorothy another chance? How do I deal with the betrayal from both my fiancée and her brother? Any insights would be appreciated. Update 1. It's been a month since my last post, and I want to thank everyone for their support and advice. Your words have been a lifeline during this difficult time. After much soul-searching and several long conversations with my closest friends and family, I decided not to give Dorothy another chance. The trust was broken, and I realized I deserved better than someone who could betray me like that. I called Dorothy and asked to meet in person to tell her my decision. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop we used to frequent. Seeing her again was harder than I expected. She looked tired and sad, a far cry from the vibrant woman I fell in love with. I told her that I couldn't continue our relationship. She cried and begged for another chance, saying she had made a horrible mistake and that she truly loved me. She said she had ended things with Ethan for good and was willing to do anything to regain my trust. I almost wavered for a moment. I could see our future together, the life we had planned, the family we had talked about. But then I remembered the sound of her laughing with Ethan in our bedroom, and my resolve strengthened. I told her I was moving out permanently and that she had 2 weeks to find a new place to live. Our lease was in my name and I had decided to keep the apartment for now. She protested at first, saying it wasn't fair to make her move out, but eventually agreed. The day I went to collect my things was one of the hardest of my life. Dorothy was there, watching silently as I packed up 6 years of my life. It was surreal going through our shared possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. As I was about to leave, Dorothy handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter explaining everything. How the affair started, why she didn't end it, and how sorry she was. She asked me to read it when I was ready. I haven't read it yet. I'm not sure if I ever will. As for Ethan, he showed up at my workplace a week after I moved out. I was leaving the office when I saw him waiting by my car. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, unkempt hair, and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. He started apologizing the moment he saw me, saying he had ruined everything and that he would do anything to make it right. I let him talk for a few minutes before I finally spoke. I told him that he had not only betrayed me but also his own sister. I said I never wanted to see or hear from him again. The look on his face when I said that will stay with me for a long time. It was a mixture of guilt, shame, and desperation. As I drove away, I saw him sink to the ground in the rearview mirror. Mark and Sarah called me a few days later. They apologized again for their children's behavior and said they understood if I never wanted to speak to them again. But they also said they considered me family and hoped that someday we could rebuild our relationship. I thanked them for their kindness but told them I needed time and space. On a more positive note, I've decided to take the job in Seattle. When I approached my boss about the possibility of a transfer, he was surprisingly understanding. He knew about my situation, word travels fast in a small company, and said he thought a fresh start might be good for me. He fast-tracked the transfer, and I'm moving in 2 weeks. I'm both terrified and excited about the move. I've never lived outside of my home state, and the thought of starting over in a new city is daunting, but it also feels liberating. Seattle represents a clean slate, a chance to reinvent myself. I've started seeing a counselor to help me process everything. It's been helpful to have someone objective to talk to about my feelings of betrayal and anger. She's been helping me work through my trust issues and fears about future relationships. As for our friends, most have been supportive of my decision to move. A few have tried to convince me to give Dorothy another chance, but I've stood firm. I've also had to cut ties with a couple of friends who knew about the affair and didn't tell me. Their betrayal, while not as deep as Dorothy and Ethan's, still stings. I'm looking forward to starting fresh in Seattle. I know it won't be easy, and there will be days when I miss my old life, but I also know that this is the right decision for me. I'm ready to close this chapter of my life and start writing a new one. Thank you all again for your support. I'll update again once I'm settled in Seattle. Update 2. It's been 3 months since I moved to Seattle, and I wanted to give you all an update on how things are going. The move itself was exhausting but liberating. Packing up my life and saying goodbye to the city I'd called home for so long was harder than I expected. I found myself getting emotional over the smallest things. My favorite coffee shop, the park where Dorothy and I used to have picnics, even the quirky doorman in my old apartment building. But as soon as I arrived in Seattle, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The city welcomed me with its iconic rainy weather, which felt fitting for my mood. My new apartment is small but has a view of the Space Needle. It's not much, but it's mine, and it doesn't hold any painful memories. My new job has been keeping me busy, which I'm grateful for. The Seattle office is smaller than my old one, which has allowed me to get to know my colleagues more quickly. They've been welcoming, and I'm enjoying the challenge of a new role. The company has a great work culture, and I've already made a few friends. I've been slowly furnishing my apartment, making it feel like home. It's been a process of rediscovering my own tastes without Dorothy's influence. I've hung up some local artwork and filled my bookshelves with novels I've always meant to read but never found the time for. As for my personal life, I'm taking things slow. I've been on a few casual dates, nothing serious. It's been nice to meet new people and remember that there's life after Dorothy, but I'm also enjoying my own company and focusing on healing. I finally read Dorothy's letter about a month after I moved. It was hard to read, but it gave me some closure. She explained how she and Ethan had grown closer while helping plan our engagement and how one drunken night had led to more. She said she had wanted to end it many times but couldn't bring herself to hurt either of us. In the end, her explanation didn't change anything, but it helped me understand a little better. Dorothy has reached out a few times since I moved. At first, it was to ask if we could try again, but when I remained firm in my decision, her messages became more about checking in and apologizing. I've been polite but distant in my responses. Ethan, on the other hand, has respected my wish for no contact. I heard through mutual friends that he moved back home with his parents and is seeking help for depression. Part of me feels sorry for him, but I remind myself that he made his choices. I've stayed in touch with Mark and Sarah. They've been incredibly kind throughout this whole ordeal, and I found their support comforting. They recently sent me a care package full of my favorite snacks from back home, which was a touching gesture. Overall, I'm doing better than I expected. There are still days when the pain and anger resurface, but they're becoming less frequent. I'm learning to trust again, both others and myself. I'm looking forward to exploring more of Seattle and building a new life here. Thank you all for your continued support and kind words. It means more than you know. Update 3. It's been a year since I moved to Seattle, and what a year it's been. I want to thank everyone who has followed my journey and offered support along the way. Life in Seattle has become home. The city's rhythm has become my own. The morning rush for coffee, the weekend crowds at Pike Place Market, the peaceful evenings watching the sunset over Puget Sound. I've even gotten used to the rain, though I still grumble about it sometimes. I've settled into my job nicely and even received a promotion last month. The project I've been working on for the past 6 months was a success, and my boss recognized my hard work. It feels good to be acknowledged for my efforts, especially after feeling overshadowed by Dorothy for so long in our old company. I've made some great friends here, both at work and through various hobby groups I've joined. I've taken up hiking, and I've been exploring the beautiful Pacific Northwest on weekends. There's something therapeutic about being out in nature, surrounded by towering trees and breathtaking vistas. This helped me find peace and perspective. As for my personal life, I have some news. About 4 months ago, I met someone. Her name is Mia, 29F, and we met at a local bookstore. We were both reaching for the same book, a new release by our favorite sci-fi author. We ended up talking for hours over coffee, bonding over our shared love of science fiction and terrible B-movies. We've been dating since then. It's still early days, but I'm happy. Mia knows about my past, and she's been incredibly understanding and patient. She doesn't push me to open up more than I'm comfortable with, and she's been supportive as I work through my lingering trust issues. We're taking things slow, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about the possibility of a future with someone. Dorothy reached out again last month. She told me she was engaged to someone new and wanted me to hear it from her rather than through the grapevine. I appreciated her thoughtfulness and wished her well. The news didn't hurt as much as I thought it would, which I take as a sign of how far I've come. I haven't heard from Ethan directly, but Dorothy mentioned that he's doing better. He's back in school, finishing his degree, and has been sober for 6 months. I'm glad he's getting his life back on track. While I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive him completely, I no longer harbor the intense anger I once did. Mark and Sarah visited me in Seattle a couple of months ago. It was nice to see them, and we had a good time catching up. They've become like surrogate parents to me, and I'm grateful for their continued presence in my life. They met Mia during their visit and seemed to like her, which meant more to me than I expected. Looking back on the past year, I'm proud of how far I've come. The pain of betrayal has faded, replaced by gratitude for the lessons I've learned and the strength I've discovered in myself. I've rebuilt my life in a new city, advanced in my career, made new friends, and even opened my heart to the possibility of love again. That's not to say everything is perfect. I still have moments of doubt and insecurity. Sometimes I catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop with Mia, expecting betrayal around every corner. But I'm working on it. I'm learning to trust my instincts again and to believe that not everyone will hurt me the way Dorothy and Ethan did. To anyone going through a similar situation, I want to say, it gets better. It's not easy, and there will be tough days, but you're stronger than you know. Don't be afraid to lean on your support system and to put yourself first. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what you need to heal and grow. Thank you all again for being part of my journey. Your support has meant the world to me. While this might be my last update for a while, know that I'm doing well and looking forward to what the future holds. We have reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, and give us your thoughts about the stories in the comments section. Thank you and see you in the next video.